Indeed. If the Battle of Britain had been lost, in other words, if we had surrendered air superiority over the United Kingdom, what would have happened, Sir Michael Graydon?
Well, Hitler had already planned to invade the country in September. He had his barges laid up in the channel ports. He was ready to go. If he'd won, as you said, the air superiority, there was every prospect that he would have actually invaded on the south coast, and who knows where would we be today.
Yes, and without the machinery, number two really, but number one, the pilots of the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, and as well as all the people in the operations rooms as well, the history of this country and perhaps the Western world would have been utterly different.
Totally different. I mean, it's impossible to imagine America coming into the war and helping us as they did later on. But at the time, we stood alone. We stood alone. And if we had gone under, I'm afraid the world would be a very different place today. But it's not just the few, as the pilots, and I've had the privilege of meeting and working with those Battle of Britain pilots, they will always stress it was the many that supported them. And it's interesting, and I think it's very important to remember the people of Bomber Command, at the same time that we were defending against the Nazis, we were actually taking the fight to them. Nobody had been able to do that to them, but Bomber Command did. And more people from Bomber Command died in the Battle of Britain than the fighter pilots, which is worth remembering. And if I may take that opportunity to say that we cherish that memory today, and I'm talking to you from Lincolnshire, the International Bomber Command Centre, which needs help. It's a wonderful place. It commemorates the 58,000 people who died in Bomber Command in World War II, and it needs your financial help. If anybody can help us, please go to the International Bomber Command Centre website and donate, and there's a crowdfunder starting on the 28th of this month.
Well, you did that magnificently, Sir Michael, and wish you a happy day as we remember all of those involved. I should say some of the fiercest pilots. Can we actually recommend the Battle of Britain as a film as well? We should be doing that. I think he's gone now. Sir Michael Graydon, former chief of the. Are you still there, Sir Michael?
I am. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I love the film.
The film was brilliant. I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, I was flying fighters myself, not in the Battle of Britain. I'm not quite that old. But at the time, the number of my colleagues were actually involved in flying Spitfires and Hurricanes when that Battle of Britain film was being made. And a great time they had, of course, because there was many of the Battle of Britain, the few, were still alive. And what great characters they all were. And I think that comes out very well in the film.
Have you flown a Spitfire?
I have flown in a Spitfire.
Oh, God, I would. I mean, honestly, the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, I know it's still operational, but every now and again, these half chances come up if you come up with a vast amount of money for charity. But I mean, what a thing. Fantastic to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Sir Michael Graydon, former Chief of the Air Staff. Battle of Britain Memorial later on today. Philip, I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to talk. COVID's not going anywhere. We'll be back next week, no doubt, talking some more about that. I hope you have a great week. I shall be back with Weekend Breakfast next Saturday from 7 a.m. Coming up at 1, it's Majid Nawaz. Next on OBC and live from Westminster, one Tom Swarbrick on Sunday. In fact, he's Tom Swarbrick every single day.
Indeed, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Morning all. Welcome to Swarbrick on Sunday at 10 o'clock.
I don't think anybody wants to go into a second lockdown, but clearly when you look at what is happening, you've got to wonder whether we need to go further than the rule of six.
The second wave now inevitable, says the PM, with hefty fines on the way for ignoring self-isolation rules.
When rules change every day, it's really confusing.
None of it makes sense.
I don't find a problem, but if everybody keeps to it, but they don't, do they?
With new cases over 4,000 a day, is a second lockdown now inevitable, or should it be avoided at all costs? We're live from Westminster across the UK. You can watch us on Global Player, Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. Swarbrick on Sunday after the news at 10.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 10 o'clock. From the end of this month, a failure to follow COVID-19 self-isolation rules in England will be illegal. Measures will be enforced by fines of between £1,000 and £10,000. The legal requirement to quarantine will apply to anyone who tests positive for COVID-19 or is identified as a close contact. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says it's a sensible move.
What I've seen in policing across the country is actually it being done by consent, cajoling people, getting people to do the right thing, and I think that's how we need to go forward. But I don't disagree with the government that in the rare cases where people are flouting the rules, something's got to be done about it. So we support them on that.
The Labour leader is also urging ministers to put children at the front of the queue for coronavirus tests. Sir Keir Starmer's warned of a potential flood of school closures unless pupils are able to access screening. Party members are taking part in a 4-day online event to replace the annual Labour conference. 4 people are being treated for serious injuries following a stabbing outside a pub in Plymouth. Armed police were called to reports of an attack near the Railway Inn in the Stoke area of the city last night. A 50-year-old man's been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. Donald Trump has pledged to name a candidate next week to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. The 87-year-old justice, one of 4 Liberals on the 9-seat bench, died on Friday. Democrats say any new appointment should wait until after November's presidential election. But at a rally in North Carolina, Mr. Trump made his plan clear.
So Article 2 of our Constitution says the president shall nominate justices of the Supreme Court. The president is supposed to fill the seat, right? And that's what we're going to do. We're going to fill the seat.
A service at Westminster Abbey this morning will mark the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. It will honour the 1,497 pilots and aircrew who died defending the skies over southern England in 1940. Organisers say the pandemic means the event will be reduced in stature, but not in spirit. And the weather. Most areas fine, warm and dry with plenty of sunshine. Cloudier across far northern Scotland and parts of northeast England. A high of 25 Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Thomas Watt.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
Just gone 10. Hello, good morning, and welcome to Swarbrick on Sunday, live and in full Technicolor here from our studio in Westminster. I'm Tom Swarbrick. Hope we find you very well this Sunday morning. Coming up,
The Prime Minister needs to do the right thing. The testing regime is all over the place. We need to put aside party differences and get that Cobra meeting together.
as Labour's virtual conference begins, polls put Starmer's party level with the Tories. We'll speak to the shadow education secretary. Also,
we are now seeing a second wave coming in. We've seen it in France, we've seen it in Spain, across Europe. It's been absolutely, I'm afraid, inevitable.
Here comes the second wave, says the PM. How does this wave differ to the first? Are we in danger of overreacting? A former chief scientific advisor will join us live.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good morning to you. It's not good news, is it? New cases over 4,000 a day again, a testing system significantly overstretched. The Prime Minister warning now that the second wave is coming in. A second wave he describes as inevitable. There have been calls in the last few days to get the military back in to help. Lots of talk too about what kind of national lockdown we might expect in the coming days. The Prime Minister in number 10 as we speak, working through the detail of what may be coming next. This morning, we read of a carrot and stick approach in getting us to follow the rules on isolating. A maximum £10,000 fine is to be introduced if you're caught leaving your home when you are meant to be isolating. Meanwhile, for those people on low pay and on benefits who are also told to isolate, they will get a lump sum of £500. This is all ahead of what looks like an announcement early next week that additional restrictions will be imposed on the whole country, a so-called second lockdown, to act as the circuit breaker to the virus and its spread. We will bring you the views on the health and social implications of a second lockdown throughout the programme. And I wonder too about whether you think a second lockdown is needed. Does it seem to you that with cases rising as they are, what the country needs now is a lockdown akin to the one that we had in March and April that would certainly see the peak of any second wave suppressed, but we all remember what we went through in those last few months, the damage that it did to the economy and actually to people's health too. I wonder when the Prime Minister and his cabinet come up with a plan for what they can install in this country to help prevent a second wave, whether you think it needs to be as restrictive as the first or whether something else can be brought in. 0345 6060 973. As I mentioned, we'll talk about health implications, economic, social. Let's turn first to the nakedly political. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown is Treasurer of the 1922 Committee of Backbench Conservative MPs and is the Conservative MP for the Cotswolds. Many thanks for joining us this morning, Sir Geoffrey. Good to have your company. I mentioned at the start the fact that the Prime Minister is meeting with ministers and others in Number 10 to work out what comes next. What do you think needs to happen in terms of a second lockdown?
Well, I think the country is at a very grave moment in the present situation. With the spike in deaths on Friday, as you said in your introduction, to 4,400, we have to treat
this...
cases, yeah. Cases, yes. We have to treat this really seriously, and I think we have to take an intelligent approach. We do know a lot more about this disease than when we first locked down. And I think what we need to be doing is to do much more on a local basis, an area-by-area basis, where we see spikes. If we shut down the whole economy, and bearing in mind I was one of the first people to call for us to come out of lockdown because of the economic situation, because of businesses, because of jobs, we really have to be careful about that. So I think the intelligent way to go forward is to have a really strong area-by-area approach. And areas like the southwest, which at the moment, mercifully, we don't have a very high incidence, it would be crazy to shut us down because tourists, businesses are just beginning to reopen. And if they are shut down again, my fear is that many of them will never reopen.
So we've seen reports of a potential sort of traffic light system for different local areas depending on the spread of cases there. Of course, all that is based upon a testing system that is robust and effective. I wonder how concerned you are by what we've seen this week when it comes to people's ability to get tests and get them quickly.
You're absolutely right. Testing is the key to this. And we ramped up expectations in the summer that everybody would be able to get a test whenever they wanted it. And that has placed a huge increase in demand on the testing system, which
so
has
the expectation went too far. You think the government rhetoric about world beating went where it was too much?
The expectation was ramped up too much. And that, combined with everybody going back to school, every time they had a cough or a sore throat, they thought they ought to get a COVID test. I think we must be much more sparing about when we do get a test. People should, when they get symptoms, should go home and isolate, and then if their symptoms get worse, then of course they should seek a test. At the same time, we need to ramp up the testing, and the government is doing that.
And on the point about getting people to follow the rules, we've seen it's front page of pretty much every single newspaper this morning, these fines of up to £10,000 for those who aren't doing as they're told to when they self-isolate, either through a positive test or by the test and trace system. Is that something that you support, the sort of the heavy hand of government and the state saying, well, if you're not staying indoors, you're going to be kicked in the wallet?
Well, I think we do have to make sure that the small minority, and I stress minority, who haven't been obeying the rules really need to do so, because whilst they may be young, they still could pass it on to an older person who could subsequently die. So it is really important that we all go back to where we were at the beginning of the lockdown, have respect for this virus and obey the rules. And that is the way, ultimately, with a vaccination, that we will get on top of this thing. After all, look at Sweden. I know Sweden is very different to us. It's got a tenth of the population density to us, but actually its population were very disciplined, obeyed the rules, actually in many cases went beyond obeying the rules, and they have suffered less. So I think for the small minority who are not obeying the rules, the message has got to go out. It's really serious. You must obey the rules.
And that is the right message, although it's 6 months into this, Sir Geoffrey. You know, if we hadn't got the point that the virus was serious by now, I wonder whether you think that is a deficiency in people's own sort of respect towards the seriousness of this, or whether there's an issue with the way in which the government have communicated this. You talk about going back to basics almost. I put it to you that really these kinds of measures should have come in a lot earlier, that testing should have been a lot more ramped up more quickly, particularly when the schools went back. And we're in this position only because what the government has decided to do hasn't been effective.
Well, there's several bits to that question, Tom, if I may say so. So the first is the testing. I do think it was fairly predictable that when the schools went back, there would be a huge increase in demand for testing. And I think we should have been very clear about who should go and seek a test. As I say, if you've just got a small cough or a sore throat, at the early stages, it probably isn't necessary to get a test. If you get worse, then there is necessity to get a test. So I think we need to do two things. I think we need to be very clear about who needs a test. We need to ramp up the testing, of course, and that is a key part of the strategy. On the other half of your really important part of your question, why are people not obeying the rules? I think it's because they feel that it's unlikely to happen to them. And that is not a good attitude, even if it hasn't happened to them. Even if they're a youngster and they're unlikely to catch it, they can pass it on to somebody else who might well be vulnerable and might well die as a result of it. So every single one of us in the population, whatever our age, needs to obey the rules.
I note that your boss, the chairman of the night, you have many bosses, Sir Geoffrey, but one of your bosses, Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, of which you are a senior member, is looking to try and make amendments to try and allow parliamentarians to have a vote on some of the changes that the government wants to bring in regarding these COVID measures. Do you think Parliament has been bypassed? And if so, what would Parliament change about what the government's done so far?
Well, I think it's really important that if these really severe measures are to have good legitimacy in the country, that their parliament and their members of parliament who they elect should be allowed to have a say and debate these matters. I'm not saying necessarily the Prime Minister, who I have a huge regard for, is getting things wrong, but I think it's important that they carry this legitimacy amongst the country, and therefore I think he should take every opportunity to debate this in Parliament. After all, as soon as we got into the Falklands situation, Parliament sat on a Saturday, it debated the pros and cons of going to war in the Falklands situation. If we could do it then, we certainly should be doing it now.
Let me ask you just very finally about the government's performance overall. There's lots of talk in the papers today about concerns in the tea room amongst Conservative MPs that Boris Johnson just really isn't up to this, actually. I mean, there are several quotes from unnamed MPs suggesting he's going to maybe not make the end of the year. I wonder how you feel about that kind of rumbling and whether you give it any credence.
I think it's totally wrong. I think the poor man is doing his very best in an almost in an unprecedented situation. He is facing this weekend really grave situation on behalf of the nation.
But he didn't need
How does he stem this disease without shutting the economy down again and causing a lot of people to lose their jobs? That is a really, really serious situation.
It is, but he didn't need to hype up expectations, as you said.
Well, I think when this thing's been going along, and you know, like you and I have watched it every day, it would be impossible. As indeed it was during the war, it would be impossible to get every decision right. But I think the general trend has been right. The health service hasn't been overwhelmed. We've learned a lot more about the disease. We've got to use that knowledge intelligently. We've got to try and get on top of it at the same time as not shutting the economy down.
Sir Geoffrey, I'm really grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Treasurer of the 1922 Committee of Conservative MPs and Conservative MP for the Cotswolds. The talk about Boris Johnson in the papers is quite extraordinary for a Prime Minister that's just run an 80-seat majority for the first time in God knows how long for a Conservative PM. There is real talk amongst MPs, it would seem, in a lot of the papers today that they've worried enough about the Prime Minister's condition and decision-making that there is talk of whether or not he might be replaced. Are the Tories going to resort to regicide again? Given the week that the government has had and the week that is to come, we hear with these new measures, I wonder how you feel about Boris Johnson's decision-making. You know, you look at the £10,000 for failing to self-isolate. The reliance on people to follow the rules is great, but if people aren't going to follow the rules, as happened in Bolton with this one guy who went to a pub crawl, having been told to self-isolate, and managed to give it to everybody in there, I wonder whether you think that kind of measure could have been brought in a lot earlier. 0345 6060 973, or is that very much the kind of rambling you'd hear from, well, I don't know, someone like Captain Hindsight? 0345 6060 973. Your call's in just a moment. Plus,
the Prime Minister's come out and said that he believes the second wave is on its way, and we're willing to support whatever action needs to be taken rather than, losing track of where they're up to.
The start of Labour's virtual conference today, a conference mood which has the party now level in the polls with the Conservatives. We'll speak to the Shadow Education Secretary, Kate Green, in just a few moments' time. Tom Swarbrick here, 10:16.
This is LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster on LBC.
Very good morning to you. 10:19 is the time you're listening and perhaps even watching to Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC. Hope we find you very well. As you've just been hearing from Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown, the Treasurer of the 1922 Committee, there is a lot of concern about what the government is currently deciding upon when it comes to a potential second lockdown. We understand that Boris Johnson is in number 10 as we speak, trying to work through the measures that we think might come in Monday, Tuesday, depending on what they decide upon and when. But we've got a flavour of the hard line that is potentially to be taken. You look at the front page of the newspapers, starting with the Sunday Telegraph this morning, fines of up to £10,000 for failing to self-isolate. Johnson cracks down as he prepares to impose even tougher restrictions on household and leisure. On the Mail on Sunday, same headline for them, £10,000 fine for leaving your house. Says something, doesn't it? PN unveils huge penalty for those breaking self-isolation rules as battle rages over second lockdown. The Sun on Sunday, Prem Kyle fiancé in fling with toy boy. not COVID related. LBC front page, lbc.co.uk, that is. Business leaders have warned they face wipeout as fears grow that a second national lockdown may be needed to stem the surging rates of coronavirus. We talked to Sir Geoffrey a bit about that. We'll have more on it throughout the programme, about the potential economic implications of another lockdown, and what type of lockdown as well. To The Observer, £10,000 fines for failing to self-isolate as infections soar. The Sunday Mirror, £10,000 fine if you refuse to self-isolate. Serial offenders will be forced into huge payouts. And frankly, comes at the point at which we discovered, I think it was yesterday, that the Bolton outbreak that was spreading around quite a lot came from one person who was due to self-isolate, meant to self-isolate. He went to a pub and ended up spreading it around. Sunday Times, £10,000 fine for people who failed to self-isolate. Astonishing quotes in there too from some Conservative MPs about the state of Boris Johnson's premiership right now. Sunday Express, £10,000 fine if you won't self-isolate. You get the theme, I think, from a lot of the papers today. We'll speak to Sir David King, chair of Independent Sage, in just a moment to see whether that second lockdown is actually necessary. Let's come to Jill first in Eastbourne, on the programme this morning. Hi there, Jill.
Good morning.
Morning to you. Your thoughts about the possibility of what's coming this week?
It seems a bit unbalanced to have all these threats of fines for not adhering to the rules when the government can't provide tests within 10 miles of anyone who has symptoms.
Well, if you've got a test that says that you're positive and you don't self-isolate, or if you've had a call from a contact tracer that says you don't that you need to self-isolate and you don't, what do you think the government ought to do?
Well, the point is we can't get a test, and we certainly can't get a result.
That's not the only way in
quickly.
which that is totally true, but that's not the only way in which you can be asked to self-isolate. If you've come into contact with somebody who has tested positive, I don't know, the one person who's been able to get a test, and you get a call to say, Jill, really, you ought to stay home now.
Yep.
Do you think enough people have?
No, probably not, but they should, yes, I do agree.
So how would you persuade them to stay at home for longer, given that they need to?
I think most people are sensible and do appreciate that this is a serious illness that we need to respect.
10 grand is a lot of money to lose out on,
I don't think they need the fines to do that, most people. There are the few, of course, that will always break the rules.
OK, Jill, appreciate it. 0345 6060 973 is the number this morning when we contemplate another lockdown in this country, although I'd be interested to get your view on what kind of lockdown you think is necessary. Surely we can't go back to what happened in March, April and May. Let's speak to Sir David King on that, chair of Independent Sage, former government chief scientific advisor. Sir David, welcome to the programme this morning. Thank you for being there with us. Do we need another lockdown, in your view?
Well, Tom, I think the background to this is that our testing and trace system has broken down completely, as you were just saying. And if this continues, the only possibility is, I'm afraid, a second lockdown. What I think the government needs to produce is a comprehensive plan taking us forward from today, from tomorrow. So let me just say, first of all, about the building a functional testing system. It has to be rebuilt based on tried and tested local National Health Service and public health structures. So these are already in place. It splits the job up down to every local GP, and that becomes a doable scale. If we continue to operate through newly formed companies that are operating at a distance, it will not work. That has been tested and it has failed. We need.
What do you want local GPs to do, Sir David, in that role? What do they provide? Because they can't provide the tests if the tests aren't there, and they can't get a result back quicker if the labs aren't working. What role do GPs play, do you see?
It would take a few days for us to finance the public health system to operate the entire scheme. Using public health laboratories, we've seen many offers from even private laboratories to assist in this process. Or research laboratories to assist in this process. All of the capability in the country has been ignored, whereas in every other country in Europe, the public health system has been used and has turned up trumps compared with ours. What we also
so what part of it, sorry to interrupt again, Sir David, but what part of it that we're using at the moment isn't really fit for purpose then, in your view? Is it the private companies that are, performing the test or taking the test back? Which bit is going wrong then that would require whole public sector provision?
It is those two private companies that have let us down very badly, but I have to say the decision to go to private companies that had no experience in healthcare was simply wrong. In the middle of a crisis, a pandemic, the worst we've had for 100 years, we start creating new companies to attempt to deal with the crisis at a very high level. We couldn't manage that, and that has been proved over the last 6 months. We're rattling away at a process that has been proved to fail. Let's turn back to the tried and tested National Health Service and Public Health Service, where the people are there that could manage that process.
Do they have the supply, though? Are they able to meet the demand that the government says is being asked for, with the schools going back and the need to get to 500,000 tests a day? Prime Minister says by the end of October. Are we really saying that the demand can be met by the public service alone?
Absolutely. That is what I'm saying, and that's what we've been saying for the past 6 months. The GPs are not able to do the testing. Local hospitals are not able to do the testing. So what I think is missing from the entire system, because the government sees this as an opportunity to create private companies that can carry through the health sector business. This is not the time to introduce that. I know it's meant to make good use of a crisis, but this is absurd. So we need clear, consistent messages about testing. We need to recruit local contact tracers. In some countries, they're using people who are volunteers to do local tracing. That means you're using shoe leather, you're knocking on doors, checking that people are tracing. It's all very well to announce fines, but how are we going to find out which people are not actually...
I wonder then, in order to get sort of boots on the ground, as it were, people going around and knocking on doors, you talk about making the use of public services. I wonder about the use of the military in all of this.
The military is a possibility as well. And if I take you back to the disease that I had to handle, the foot and mouth disease epidemic, we had to turn to the military to manage it, and they managed it extremely well. So I think that is not a bad idea, Tom. But we need an absolutely clear strategy. And now, because the test and trace is failing, and it would take 3-4 days or maybe a week to get it up through the public services, I would say we need immediate measures. So immediate measures to control the rise in the epidemic, closing indoor pubs and restaurants, however difficult that might be, however unpopular.
Across the country?
Across the country, yes. We need to ask people to work at home if possible, not return to workplaces unless those workplaces are COVID safe. We need to make sure there's financial support for those employees who cannot return to work because they don't have COVID-safe places to work.
I'll put it to you just finally then, Sir David, as you go through the plan for what you say ought to come, that there are many who are looking at the number of cases and thinking, my gosh, here we go again, but looking at the hospitalisations and looking at the deaths and thinking, really, if we were to shut down in areas of the country where they don't really have a spread of the virus, the pubs and the bars and the restaurants, crippling that part of the economy, telling people not to go into work, crippling the assorted areas of the economy that come with that. This is unnecessary. It doesn't need this. What would you say to them?
I would say this is a last resort. It's a last resort forced on us only because of the test and trace incapacity. In other words, how do we know where the outbreaks are if we don't have a test and trace system that's operating? I think the last resort is, I'm afraid, a second lockdown for all of the reasons, Tom, and I totally sympathise with them. We don't want to continue a lockdown again. We all had to put up with that for far too long anyway, precisely because the government acted far too slowly, incredibly slowly, right at the beginning, going into lockdown when the epidemic was increasing, doubling at every 3 to 4 days. That means quadrupling every week.
Sir David, great to have you on the programme. Thank you for your time. Sir David King, Chair of Independent Sage and, of course, the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the government. I wonder what you make of what you've heard there. 0345 6060 973, that in order to prevent the second wave coming now, we need to lock down hard now and give it all over to the public sector. Let the NHS do it, let GPs get involved, perhaps even bring in the military in order to knock on people's doors to make sure that they are self-isolating. 0345 6060 973, the number this morning. Plus, coming up after the news headlines...
I think there's a real concern now that the government hasn't got sufficient control over what's going on.
Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, on the beginning of Labour's party conference, will speak to the Shadow Education Secretary, Kate Green, after the news, which at 10:31 on Swarbrick on Sunday comes from Thomas Watts.
People in England with COVID-19 will soon be required to self-isolate by law. Those who fail to quarantine when they test positive or are identified by contact tracers will face fines of up to £10,000. A man's been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder after a stabbing outside a pub in Plymouth. 4 people are being treated for serious injuries that aren't believed to be life-threatening. The 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain will be commemorated at Westminster Abbey in the next hour. The memorial, followed by a flypast, will remember the pilots and aircrew who died defending southern England in 1940. And the weather, most areas fine, warm and dry today. Cloudier across the far north of Scotland and parts of northeast England. A high of 25 Celsius.
LBC.
Broadband.
Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Text 84850.
Very good morning to you. 10:34 is the time. We'll speak to the Shadow Education Secretary, Labour's Kate Green, in just a few moments as the Labour conference gets underway. Let's come to some of your thoughts, though, on what you're hearing thus far about the potential for a second lockdown. David's in Enfield this morning. Morning, David.
Good morning, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, sir. How do you feel on this auspicious Sunday morning?
Nice to hear you on Sunday morning. I have a pretty extreme view on this, and many people won't agree with me. But I think the problem has been for the UK generally is that the approach to this lockdown has been far too liberal, and we should have had far more draconian measures imposed in March and April. And I'll tell you why. I'm originally from the Isle of Man, and most people will know it's in the middle of the Irish Sea. It's an offshore tax haven and financial centre, population of 85,000. A lot of older people, and the minute they had their first cases in March, they imposed draconian measures.
They did, and they stopped people coming in. You're right, they closed the borders, they stopped people coming in. You're absolutely right, David. The thing I was thinking, though, when you talked about draconian measures... Hang on. The thing I thought when you talked about draconian measures, you look at a country like Spain, which had greater measures imposed on its people than were imposed here, and they're getting a second spike. I mean, they're seeing cases go up again. I appreciate that it worked for the Isle of Man. All I'm saying is, can you scale that up to an entire nation of many millions of people?
I think it's the basic principle. The basic principles they can learn from. Close the borders. The Isle of Man is like a mini offshore city of London. Its main business is tax management and financial services. And fortunately, the Isle of Man is, although technically in the British area, it's a self-governing crown dependency, so they can make up their own policy towards dealing with COVID. And they closed down everything at the beginning of March. As a result, they were able to, from May to September, have no new COVID infections for the whole of 3 months. So they could reopen.
Well, I just don't know, David. I mean, I totally appreciate. I know Malaysia is doing something similar in that you have to apply to leave the country, or you have to apply to come into the country, and the government will have a say there. Maybe something could happen akin to that in this country, but it might be a bit late because, as we've all been told and all known, once the virus is here, it is here to stay. David, thank you very much. Let's come to Lucy, a new caller to the programme this morning in Barnes. Hi, Lucy.
Hi. Thanks very much for having me.
No, you're welcome. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm very, very, very disappointed, actually, by the lack of leadership, the lack of anyone brave enough, bold enough and strong enough to turn around and actually say viruses have existed since the dawn of man. The probability of death is 100%. And why there can't be slightly more of a balanced approach to this is beyond any kind of comprehension that I can really get my head around.
What is unbalanced about the approach at the moment?
The approach is entirely unfocused on COVID, yet we're not looking at the people not being diagnosed from cancer, the people living in chronic pain who are unable to have operations. My son hasn't had a diabetic checkup for months and months and months because it's unable to open hospitals. The amount of businesses that will go bankrupt. We are going hell for leather on pursuing a strategy that supports some sort of inevitability about trying to prevent the end of COVID, which you're not going to do. COVID is going to keep evolving. It's part of the family of flu viruses. I don't believe there will ever be a vaccine.
Well, I mean, on that, Lucy, I really hope you're wrong. Just on the point about it's here and therefore it's here to stay, right back at the start of this, I mean, my programme at 10 p.m. Monday to Thursday, we were the first programme on LBC to talk about this thing that was happening in Wuhan in China. And there's a report from 2011, the Influenza Pandemic Preparedness Plan, which says very clearly, once it's here to stay. It's impossible to suppress. The idea of no COVID as a strategy, I agree with you, is ultimately wrong. But doesn't this all really point to the fact that the system we've got in place to manage this, i.e. the test and trace system, it's just not working? It can't deal with it.
Well, the test and trace is a joke. My dad, who believes he has COVID, was trying for more than 2 weeks. I mean, he's nearly 80 years old. Complete loss of sense of smell and so on. Tried for more than 12 hours on various days. I mean, not all in one go. Various days. But he totaled it up to 12 hours being online, on phone calls, trying to get some sort of a test. His GP eventually tried to put his mind at rest, saying that we're very confident that you probably had it. But if you can't isolate, if you can't understand who's even got it, the thing has already spread beyond any kind of controllable point at this rate.
Well, you wonder, Lucy, listen, I'm going to have to leave it there because my guest is waiting for me, but I appreciate the point that you're making. I'm sorry that it's been so difficult in getting a test. As you speak for many millions of people, I'm afraid. Thank you for your call. 0345 6060 973 is the number. More of your calls in just a few moments. 10:39. Let's turn to Kate Green, Shadow Education Secretary, Labour MP for Stretford and Urmston. Not just on whatever's going on around COVID, Kate, which could take up an entire hour and more, I'm afraid, but also on the start of the Labour Party conference, a virtual conference this year. You want to see children at the front of the queue when it comes to tests. Tell us how you would like to see that done.
Well, we massively need to increase testing capacity, but of course we knew children were coming back to school in September, so it's very disappointing that the government didn't put all of that in place for the start of term. But I do think children need priority for tests so that they can be brought back to school quickly if they test negative. And we're calling for every parent to be able to get a test for their child if they display symptoms within 24 hours and to get the results back in a further 24 hours. I'm really worried, Tom, that what we're already beginning to see just 2 or 3 weeks into term is whole year groups being sent home because one child tests positive. Then they can't come back because they can't get tests. And then after 14 days, when they do come back, of course, the whole thing could happen all over again if another child becomes unwell. And this is just going to cause massive, massive disruption to children's education if the government can't get a grip and get the tests.
So we talk about children at the front of the queue, or Labour talks about children at the front of the queue. I note that some of your colleagues have talked about NHS staff being at the front of the queue, about care staff being at the front of the queue. The difficult thing with priorities is you're going to have to pick one.
Yeah, well, obviously everybody understands that health and care staff are absolutely top priority, and we've been saying that for months. But now that schools are back, I do think we've got to really ensure not just that we got children back to school, which is good, but that we keep them there. And that does mean that the very next hard decision that has to be made must be to keep schools open. If that means closing other premises, and I know how hard this is, Tom, it means people's jobs, it's their livelihoods, but if it means leisure or retail or hospitality has to close so that children can stay in school, that is the hard choice that we have to take.
Let me ask you then about how many tests you think might be needed. Boris Johnson talking about 500,000 a day. Is that the figure that you as the Labour Party are settled on, you think is required?
It sounds right to me. I mean, I'm not in a position fully to say. Sure. Without all the analysis that the government has access to. That's certainly well short of the 10 million a day that we were hearing about the other day. I have no idea what that was about, utterly unrealistic. It's also, though, well above what we're currently seeing, which I understand is less than half of 500,000 a day in practice. So clearly we need some massive scaling up pretty rapidly.
Let's talk about the scaling up of fines for people. Do you agree with a maximum £10,000 fine for those who aren't self-isolating when they should be?
Well, I think we do need very tough penalties for people who willfully and perhaps repeatedly ignore the rules. And some of the stories we've heard are just inexplicable. There's lack of care, not for only their own safety, but for everybody else's safety too. My worry about enforcement, though, Tom, is that where are the police going to find the time and resources to do this? In Greater Manchester, where I'm an MP, we've already seen cuts to our police numbers of, a couple of thousand over the last 10 years. So I am concerned not just about the penalties, but also about the capacity for enforcement.
And that is clearly something that the government is going to have to work out. But the principle you support, I wonder whether you support the principle of another lockdown that's being mooted at the moment.
Well, everybody really, really hopes that we're not going to have to get there because it is so damaging, not just for our economy, but also for people's emotional and social well-being. Where I am in Trafford, we've actually had extra restrictions put back in place at the end of July, and they are onerous. Everybody feels that, and, we miss being with friends and family. But I do think as we head into winter, we have to make sure that we don't let the situation escalate out of control. And I'm very worried that we're already on that path. And I'm afraid that it does look to me as if tougher action may be needed quite soon.
In order to try and persuade people to stay in, particularly those people on lower incomes and on benefits, we read this morning that they'll be offered a grant of £500 lump sum in order to persuade them that they can afford to stay in. Do you think £500 is enough?
Well, I certainly welcome this offer from the government because for a long time Labour has been pushing ministers on the fact that statutory sick pay is really inadequate to live on, and for a lot of workers in insecure jobs they don't have access to it at all. So it's good that the government has been listening and that they are now talking about a sum which is more meaningful. Of course, it will depend for how long and how often people have to isolate. You might be able to manage for a couple of weeks on that kind of an income, but I do worry about the cumulative effect. And that, again, is why it's so crucial that we get the testing and tracing system working to full potential so that people don't have to spend days and days isolating at home with their income cut, their earnings cut, when they could actually quickly get a negative test and get back to work.
Let me ask you about the Labour Party specifically then, given your conference begins, albeit virtually, over the course of this weekend. Sir Keir Starmer very, very clear in saying, well, he's branded it as this is new leadership. How is this leadership different to Jeremy Corbyn's?
Well, it's not just about the different leader of the Labour Party. It's about the leadership that we think the country needs. We're in an absolute once-in-a-lifetime crisis with the pandemic, and that's going to create not just immediate short-term pressures, but longer-term challenges.
You've done that, I have to say, Kate, you've done that very neatly, the switch from it's not just the leadership about the country, about the party, but the country, because you don't want to be... But specifically between... Jeremy Corbyn failed twice to be elected as Prime Minister, the second time catastrophically. Surely Labour MPs like yourself, I know you're a big supporter of Sir Keir Starmer's, you would want to see a change in the leader and how the leader operates. What's the biggest change you think Sir Keir Starmer can bring from what Jeremy Corbyn offered?
Well, we are in a very different context, in fairness, to the elections that Jeremy was fighting in 2017 and 2019. And I think here is the right leader for the challenge we face, the immediate challenge we face, because I think he's demonstrating that leadership, Tom. He's been both constructive in offering support to the government, for example, offering to get round the table early on to talk about how we could get children back to school. He's also been bold about suggesting what hard decisions need to be taken and calling for them early. So I think he is the right leader for the crisis. But I also think once we get through the pandemic and the immediate crisis, we need a visionary, principled leader to take us through what are going to be the long-term impacts of that crisis, the social injustice, the inequality, and so on. Keir's values speak to a country that is fair and gives opportunities for everyone. He believes in that passionately, and I think he's the leader, and that Labour is the party that people need.
And to win back those Brexit-supporting Labour voters, or those who voted for the Conservatives in the red wall seats, a fair and principled leader who wanted to see the result of a referendum rerun.
Well, I think we didn't want to rerun the referendum, to be absolutely clear. What we said was when the referendum took place in 2016, we didn't know what the deal on offer would be.
He wanted another one. He wanted to remain.
No, we did want another. Oh, absolutely. And I think it's important to be honest. I wanted to remain too. But we eventually had a deal on the table. And our position was, now that we know what the deal is, we should give the country a final say. That was what the second referendum was. It wasn't a rerun of the first. All that's water under the bridge now, Tom. We've left the European Union.
I don't know that it is for voters. I don't. We'll wait and see. But Kate, listen, I'm really grateful to you.
It's a good question, but we'll get water under the bridge. And the really crucial thing now is that we get the exit deal. You know, we're leaving the transition period at the end of this year. It's an incredibly dangerous moment for the country. Boris Johnson said he had enough and ready deal. We're dangerously close to leaving with no deal at all, and that will be disastrous. And the government must deliver on the promise to deliver a deal that it made.
Kate Green, you're the Shadow Education Secretary, Labour MP for Stretford and Erms. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme this morning. Kate Green. 0345 6060 973 is the number. You'll hear from Len McCluskey, the leader of the Unite Union, a little bit later on in the show. We'll talk much more about Labour's efforts, the fact that they are level in the polls right now, even before the so-called conference bounce that tends to happen after a party conferences take place. We'll talk about Labour in more detail a bit later on in the show. 0345 6060 973. We'll speak to a former Conservative Health Minister and peer in just a few moments too. Tom Swarbrick here, 10:48.
This is LB. This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
10:51 is the time. We'll speak to Baroness Nicola Blackwood in just a few moments. Let's go to Pauline on 84850 first. Tom, morning. With regard to a total lockdown, I do not agree. We in the southwest have been very low with COVID infections. It's very unfair to us that we have to shut down because of the selfishness of people meeting up in huge groups. It should be by region only, she says. Zoe's in East Riding in Yorkshire. Morning to you, Zoe.
Oh, hang on.
Hang on.
Hang on.
You're on. No.
Sorry, you were on speakerphone. You were talking to the MP, so.
Yes, you had to wait, Zoe. I apologise that I had to wait for the MP.
Oh, that's
but you're on now. You've got the floor is yours.
Hello. Well, thank you for talking to me. Now, I agree with the previous lady that you just read out. It's not fair to do it via the whole country. We've had hardly any. I live in a small, well, it's not really that small, a village of 20,000, and 2 people have died. That's 1 in 10,000. Don't you think that's vastly over-exaggerated? You know,
a lockdown that would shut the restaurants and the bars or the cafes or in East Riding or prevent you from going out after 10 p.m, that would be too much for you?
I wouldn't mind sort of, shutting, going back to the previous, like when I was growing up, we had to go home at 10:30 from the pubs. But, we go out to the local large cities and all the shops are shut. It's not fair. People only shut shops and it's not fair. And we don't... and then what would we do in a few months' time when it went down again? Shut it, open it all up again and do it all over and over and over and over again.
You make a very good point, Zoe. You make a very good point about the suppressing of the peak. Doesn't mean that it disappears. It can pop up again into another moment. The point is you've got to manage the peak or manage the cases. And at the moment, for whatever reason, the test and trace system doesn't seem to be able to do that. Zoe, we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for the call. 10:53 is the time. Baroness Nicola Blackwood is on the line, Conservative peer, former Health Minister under Theresa May, and of course Boris Johnson too. Nicola, thank you for coming on the programme this morning. Let's start with the £10,000 fine for people who fail to self-isolate. Is that the kind of stick that's needed here?
Well, there has been a challenge, and one of the reasons that we are in the situation that we're in today is that SAGE has found that only 1 in 5 are isolating when they do find their symptoms. And I understand frustrations because people have been struggling to get tests. But the reality is that cases will keep going up as they have been, and cases in hospitals will be doubling every 8 days, as we've found today, if people don't abide by the restrictions. And it's obviously frustrating because as the situation continues month after month until we get a vaccine, it is frustrating to comply with the requirements. But the reality is that if we don't comply with the less restrictive requirements, like wearing face masks, social distancing and isolating for 2 weeks if you get symptoms, then more restrictive requirements come in. And so you can understand why penalties and restrictions are coming in for those the minority who are not abiding by the restrictions.
If it's a minority that are not abiding with restrictions and therefore causing the spread of cases, as we've seen in places like Bolton, to what extent do people like Zoe, who we've just heard from, chime with you that the second lockdown, a sort of blunt instrument of a second lockdown for the whole country, is unfair?
Well, I think it's an important question about, this isn't going to be like the first time where we didn't have information about what worked and what didn't, where cases had escalated to complete community transmission. And also, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about deaths. What we know now is that even mild cases can lead to something called long COVID, where you have a chronic illness which leaves you unwell for months and months and months and unable to go about your normal life. And this can affect 10 to 15% of people who get even a mild condition. And I think that that's something that we should be worried about. So, I don't think talking about lockdown versus not lockdown is helpful. I think what we should be talking about is restrictions that affect perhaps 10% of normal life. So shutting down the pubs earlier, so you don't get communication of the illness there, or in something that impacts 90% of daily life. So you have have complete lockdown like we had before, and we know much more than we did before. We know how to treat the illness thanks to clinical trials.
Can I just ask you about that, Sage? Sorry to interrupt, Nicola.
Go on.
Sorry to interrupt you. But can I just ask you about that figure that you pulled from Sage, that 1 in 5 asked to self-isolate are not self-isolating?
Yeah.
That's pretty stark. How long have Sage known that?
This was only announced in the last few days, so I think it's relatively recent data that has been announced recently.
But that must have been compiled over the last few months. Do you think then that asking people to return to work, get back to work, or you'll lose your job was one of the front pages relatively recently? Do you think that was a mistake?
I don't think it was particularly helpful, if I'm honest. I think that what we need to have is those who are able to work from home, working from home, and those who can't work from home, working from work. Because even if you have COVID restrictions in the workplace, only a percentage of those who are in the office are able to be there anyway. So we do have to have a nuanced approach to being in the workplace. And you might want to cycle people through being in the workplace anyway, and have some in on some days and other in on other days. And also, because we do have local data, even as Zoe said, that in some areas you have higher prevalence of the disease, then in those areas you might want to say everybody stay home now and work from home. Okay. And then in other areas it's perfectly fine to go into work. And this is how we should be approaching it, in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way. But in order to do that, you need to fix testing, build up local infrastructure with authorities' data and tracing, so that people can track local spikes. And you do need to have clear messaging on the fact that until there is a vaccine, the reality is that we will have ups and downs with restrictions stopping and starting, because the virus will come and go with more cases coming and more cases going. And we are going to have to accept that. And we're going to all have to do our bit, even if we get incredibly frustrated with what we see as the government not doing as well as possible. It is self-defeating for us not to do what we know is going to protect ourselves and our livelihoods by making sure that we restrict the transmission of the virus. Because if we wear masks, and if we distance, and if we wash our hands, and if we do what we know will protect ourselves and our family members and those around us from the virus, then we will also be protecting our economy. Yeah. And all of us as individuals know that that's the right thing to do. And by doing that, we will stop the virus from spreading, and we will keep our economy going.
I'm very grateful to you for your time. Thank you very much indeed. Baroness Blackwood, Nicola Blackwood, Conservative peer, former health minister under both Theresa May and, of course, Boris Johnson. By the way, there was that lockdown protest, wasn't there, yesterday, where we saw people arrested. If you were at that, I'd love to speak to you this morning. 0345 6060 973. Coming up after the news at 11.
The government has let working people down. People shouldn't have to traipse halfway around the country in search of a COVID test when they're sick.
Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, on the eve of their party conference and now level in the polls. You'll hear from the Unite leader, Len McCluskey. Also,
please could we make greater use of our fine armed forces? It is not a mark of failure to lean on their versatile skills when we are faced with such an enduring emergency.
As you may have heard from the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, Sir David King, calls potentially to look at what more the military could do in stepping up its help and support to try and manage us through the second lockdown. We'll speak to the Conservative MP, Tobias Elwood. Your views too, as we stand on the beginning of a week where we could see another UK-wide lockdown.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 11 o'clock. A legal duty for people with COVID-19 to self-isolate is being introduced in England, enforced by fines of up to £10,000. It will apply to those who test positive or are contacted by NHS Test and Trace. It's hoped the restrictions will stem a rise in infections. Health Secretary Matt Hancock has warned the rules will get tougher if they're not followed.
I don't want to see more measures, more restrictive measures, but unfortunately, if people don't follow the rules, that's how the virus spreads.
Ministers in Westminster are in discussion with the devolved administrations about extending the law across the UK. A former chief scientific advisor has told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC the coronavirus testing system has broken down completely. The government is under increasing pressure amid rising demand for COVID-19 screening. Ministers say they're working to increase capacity. Professor Sir David King, chair of the independent SAGE group, says the system should be decentralised.
If this continues, the only possibility is, I'm afraid, a second lockdown. What I think the government needs to produce is a comprehensive plan taking us forward from today, from tomorrow.
Labour is calling for the government to entrust the testing system to local authorities. The party's holding an online event in the place of its annual conference, which was cancelled because of the pandemic. A man in his 50s is being questioned on suspicion of attempted murder after a stabbing outside a pub in Devon. 3 men were seriously hurt and 2 women were hit by a vehicle in Plymouth last night. Donald Trump has pledged to name a candidate next week to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. The 87-year-old justice, one of 4 Liberals on the 9-seat bench, died on Friday. Democrats say any new appointment should wait until after November's presidential election. A service marking the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain is taking place at Westminster Abbey. Around 200 people are attending the scaled-down event to remember the pilots and aircrew who died protecting the skies over southern England in 1940. And the weather, most areas fine, warm and dry with plenty of sunshine, cloudier across the far north of Scotland and parts of northeast England, a high of 25 Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Thomas.
Over.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good morning to you. 3 minutes past 11 is the time you're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC and possibly watching us too, available on Global Player, on Twitter, on Facebook, YouTube, you name it, we're on it somewhere. As I said last week, it's an all-out assault on your senses. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to join us this morning. I want to talk more about testing over the course of the next 60 minutes. We'll talk about Labour after 12. We'll speak to Alistair Campbell. We've got Len McCluskey, the leader of Unite, coming on as well. Given it's the start of their conference and the papers have them level with the Conservatives in the polls right now, at least according to one poll. That is good news for the Labour Party, of course. I wonder why you think that might be. We'll talk about that after 12. I want to focus on testing, though, given that it is the test and trace system that is necessary to manage the new normal to prevent things like a second lockdown. Of course, we've all got to adhere to the rules too. But you will know about the struggles of trying to get a test, people sent all around the country, people not able to get results back for days and days and days. I wonder how that experience has left you this week. 0345 6060 973, particularly in those parts of the country that have seen extra lockdown measures put into place. You know you need to get a test. You've wanted to get a test. You've tried to get a test, but you just can't. Labour this morning talking about making children the priority, as well, of course, as NHS workers and social care staff and everybody else that wants to be a priority too. How important is it to get the children tested to allow them to get back into school so that classrooms aren't so disrupted? 0345 6060 973. We'll talk to Tobias Elwood, Conservative MP, chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, about the potential use of the military in all of this. I just want to read you this before I bring in Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. From Neil Ferguson, Professor Neil Ferguson. You remember him, Professor Lockdown as he was dubbed, the man whose modelling at Imperial College London apparently changed the strategy that was being adopted by government in March and in April. He was interviewed yesterday and he talked about the demand on the testing regime that was coming from the schools coming back in. And he said that the demand for tests from possibly symptomatic children in schools, 97% of whom tested negative, which is obviously a good thing, he said it wasn't predicted by anyone. Quotes, completely unanticipated by anyone, end quotes. And it made me think, actually made me drop my piece of toast as I was hearing this thing, because I wondered how many people in government are on these committees, how many of them are parents? How many of them didn't realise that, of course, what happens when kids go back to school is they start to get unwell. They get coughs, they get colds, they get sniffles. Who was it that was meant to anticipate this, and why didn't they? 0345 6060 973. 11:05. Andy Burnham's here, Mayor of Greater Manchester, former Secretary of State for Health under Gordon Brown, of course. Welcome to the programme, Andy. Thank you for being there for us.
You're welcome, Tom.
Let's start with how Greater Manchester is this Sunday and what you're anticipating in terms of what's coming next week.
Well, how's Greater Manchester this Sunday? I guess we're in an uncertain position. The case numbers are still high and rising. And as you say, the government is talking about further restrictions. We don't yet know what those might be. And the truth is, Tom, people are probably pretty confused, frustrated, because they've struggled all week to get access to tests. The restrictions that we have are different in different places. So it's a bit of a messy picture, if I'm honest with you. And I think people's mood here probably reflects a little bit of frustration and fatigue with all of that.
Which is understood, of course, and there is lots more that the government can be doing, or could be doing, and should be doing in order to make that better. But let me come to what we've seen over the last few days, which is that some people just aren't following the rules. So you've got the chap in Bolton who was asked to self-isolate, who went on a pub crawl and seems to have been the super spreader that affected cases there. As we're just hearing that Sage was suggesting that 1 in 5 who are meant to be isolating are not. As much as this is the government's problem to deal with, how much individual responsibility should people be taking to manage themselves and look after themselves and others?
Oh, of course, people should be taking responsibility. And the case in Bolton that you refer to is completely unacceptable. But that figure about 1 in 5 struggling to self-isolate, it isn't just that they're just flouting the request. It's that people can't afford to self-isolate in many of our communities. And I have to say, credit, finally, where it's due to the government for recognising this, a call that I and the Mayor of the Liverpool City region have been making for months, and that is some people will need financial support to self-isolate. And finally, Tom, it's been acknowledged this morning that that is what will be done. And that, I have to say, is a good sign of the government listening and us putting in place the right support as we head into the rest of the autumn and the winter. So, it's a complicated picture. If the government get in the business of blaming the public for this, then I think we're going to get into the wrong place completely. We've got to appeal to everybody's better nature to say everyone needs to play their part.
The rules. The public also have to follow the rules too. I realise that, if we start the blame game, then it gets a bit unedifying. But it is also true to say, isn't it, as the government is doing today, that people need to start taking this very, very seriously. Some people, unfortunately, are not. And as we've seen in South Korea and now in Bolton, it only takes one with the symptoms and with the disease to start spreading it around again.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm certainly one who would support stronger enforcement against people who are, very directly breaking what's being asked of them. So, yeah, I'm not shying away from that. But I don't think we need to turn this whole thing about that, because they're a very small minority, in my view, and the majority of people are following the rules, and they feel very frustrated, obviously, when others are not. So definitely take action against those who are not. But let's not kind of make this all about it's the public's fault. I don't think it is. They've got confusing messages being given out to them by the government at times. It was all eat out to help out a few weeks ago, and now, of course, it's the opposite. So, everyone's got their own responsibility here, haven't they, to do the right thing, including the government, including me and what I do in Greater Manchester. And I think we need to kind of re-establish, Tom, a sense of national unity as we go into what I would predict will be the most challenging part of this whole crisis yet, and that will be the remainder of the autumn and the winter.
You talk about that national unity. Sadiq Khan, one of your colleagues, the Mayor of London, has suggested he's going to try and get ahead of the game and might bring in measures rather more quickly for London than the government does perhaps for the rest of the country. What powers do you have to do that for Greater Manchester, and are you considering them?
Well, we've been under restrictions for some weeks now, unlike London, and our experience will be that maybe they have some impact, but I think sometimes it's overemphasised the amount of impact that these restrictions have. I would certainly applaud Sadiq for taking that step. In terms of what more can I do, I've made an offer to the government to provide more resources to support contact tracing, which clearly isn't working properly. And I've got Greater Manchester Police and our fire service being willing to put forward frontline staff to help get in touch with people who need to isolate. And with this new support package that's coming today, I think we've got a real chance now of making this work. It's got to be about local action and national action together. And Tom, what I would say is, let's have all of those voices on COBRA and reconvene COBRA.
Yeah. Well, just on that point about the measures that you're under, in what way are they not working? Do you think they're not tough enough? They're not persuading people to do the right thing enough?
Well, I think there's always going to be a limit to what blanket restrictions can achieve. Certainly when they came in, I think they had an impact because people noticed the change and it stopped the gathering that we were seeing across Greater Manchester, particularly in people's homes. But the longer that they're in and the more confusing they've become, because some boroughs have been released from the restrictions, I think their impact is diminishing all of the time. So I would say to the government, you must not sort of put all your kind of hopes on restrictions as the way through this. It's part of the story, but only part.
Andy Burnham, grateful for your time. Thank you. The Mayor of Greater Manchester, former Secretary of State for Health under Gordon Brown. 11 minutes past 11. Let's turn to Tobias Elwood, who is Chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, MP for Bournemouth East, given that his comments earlier in the liaison committee that the Prime Minister sat in front of last week were to try and get more military involvement into the test and trace system, in fact, into it generally. I mean, I do wonder, actually, what that would feel like for this country if you are not only being told that you are going to be fined for staying in your home or for not staying in your home to the tune of £10,000, to have, I don't know, a member of the armed forces knock on the door to say, are you meant to be outside, aren't you meant to be inside? I wonder how that would feel as part of the sort of authoritarianism that people are worried about here. 0345 6060 973. We'll speak to Tobias Elwood in a few moments' time. Jason is a new caller in Orpington this morning. Hi there, Jason.
Hi there, Tom. How are you doing?
Yes, I'm good. Tell us about your inability to get a test.
Well, my first concern, as I raised to your producer, is the stats that you're quoting about Stage are incorrect. Okay? What you're saying is that 1 in 5 people are not self-isolating. What Sage have actually said is that only 1 in 5 people are self-isolating, which means 4 in 5 or less are not self-isolating. So less than 20% are self-isolating when they're being told to. It's a much bigger problem.
That means greater restrictions, then, doesn't it? That means you need to be fined. That means you need to be punished to try and get people to stay in.
Absolutely. If you cannot encourage people to do it voluntarily, then the fines have to come in. And I think, as I said to the producer, I don't think they go far enough. I think it's great that you're going to find people that are not self-isolating when they should be, but also what about people not wearing face masks, not following the rules on public transport and potentially in shops as well, although it's more difficult. But certainly on public transport, if you're trying to encourage everybody to use public transport again and return to the office because it's safe, if people are not wearing the mask on public transport, it's clearly not safe. And there's no enforcement.
Yeah. I wonder, Jason, how you feel about the idea that people were sort of, perhaps the phrase, given a chance, in order to take the responsibility for themselves, rather than have these sort of big state sticks hitting them to tell them to stay in or to tell them to wear a mask or whatever. Do you think it was right to offer people the opportunity to do it for themselves before then clamping down a bit harder?
I can understand the point. I don't think it was right, only because we don't do that with other offences. So, for example, if you're over the limit, you're not offered a chance for drink driving. If you're over the limit, you are fined, and there are consequences to your actions. I think it was made so clear, everybody understood the need to do it, and it's just a small section of people, certainly on the face mask side of things, on public transport, that seem to refuse. It's almost like
we had these protests yesterday, didn't you? You had these hundreds and hundreds of people out in Trafalgar Square. It kicked off a bit with police. About 30 people were arrested, all saying, "Well, we're not going to wear one. This is an infringement of our liberty." I've never really. It's not that much skin off your nose, is it, to wear a face mask? Come on.
No, I don't particularly like it. Yes, it's a little bit uncomfortable, if you're wearing it for a long time in a shop. But you're doing it because you're protecting people. You're not protecting yourself. you're protecting everybody else, and if everybody else is wearing it, then everybody, including yourself, is protected.
All right. Jason,
it's common sense.
I'm grateful to you for the call, saying we should be going harder at this and there should be greater punishment for people not following the rules. 0345 6060 973. If that is going to be the case, by the way, if you're going to get, as all the papers this morning have it, £10,000 fine for people who fail to self-isolate. If that's going to be the case, that you could get one of those fines if you're not in your house or if you're stepping out because you need to go and get some milk or some bread, are you going to be persuaded to get a test? A lot of people suggesting that, well, if I'm going to be hit in the wallet like that, I'm not going to give my phone number when it comes to contact tracing when I go to a cafe or a pub. And I certainly won't be getting a test if I feel a little bit unwell, just in case I have to stay home and in case I get hit with these fines. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Your call's in just a moment. Plus,
please could we make greater use of our fine armed forces? It is not a mark of failure to lean on their versatile skills when we are faced with such an enduring emergency.
Is it time to bring the military in? They were involved in the test and trace process before. They've been involved in the setting up of the Nightingale hospitals. Their involvement has been put on the back foot for a little while. Is it now time to get them in again? 0345 6060 973 is the number. We'll speak to Tobias Elwood after in a few moments' time. Tom Swarbrick here, 11:16.
This is LBC. Space. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
11:19 is the time. Morning to you. Lots of people struggling this week to get tests. Lots of people being sent all around the country to various parts of it that they've never been to before, that would take them many hours to get there in order to try and get one. What's been the impact of that on you? Have you found that you've not been able to go about your business as normal, that the kids are coming home from school and they're coming home with coughs and colds and you thought, not sure, so I get them a test? That means that presumably they've got to self-isolate. That means you can't go to work, and that cycle could repeat and repeat and repeat until we get this test and trace system ready. We'll speak to Tobias Elwood, the Conservative MP, in just a few moments. First, Elle is a new caller to Swarbrick on Sunday this morning in Leicester. Hi there, Elle.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. What made you pick up the phone?
I just have a slight concern, obviously, in regards to the industry in which I work with. I work in the aviation sector, and obviously a second national apologies, I don't have any interaction with the testing. Fortunately, well, I shouldn't really be apologising, but fortunately...
No, I was going to say, that's lucky for you. I mean, a lot of people wish that they didn't have to, but yeah. So but in aviation, clearly the talk of a second lockdown is going to make you gulp.
Yes, so I think more recently, maybe in the last month, I have been thinking a lot in regards to like my job and obviously job security, and with the furlough, I don't wish furlough on anyone, but with the furlough scheme coming to an end, it's sort of like for myself thinking, okay, so if there is a second lockdown, how is it going to affect the economy? And obviously that has an impact on the aviation sector. Already, there's not a lot of foot traffic in regards to people taking...
and have you been on furlough since March?
No, sorry. Let me just correct myself. What I meant was, if there's a second lockdown, and with already the impact on the aviation sector, and like, for instance, us and what we do in regards to financing aircraft, how are we going to be affected?
This is where these travel corridors are going to have to be sorted out, if indeed they can be any more sorted out than they are at the moment. I just don't know, El, that many people, if there is a second lockdown with the cases going up in the way that they are, people aren't going to want to fly, are they? I mean, they just see it as too much of a risk.
So, for instance, I don't even know if, let's say, for instance, I think Birmingham was on lockdown. Are they still going on holiday? To what extent are you allowed to book a flight if there is a restriction in your area?
Well, I do wonder, when the Prime Minister, El, thank you, by the way, when the Prime Minister talks about the virus coming in, or a second wave coming in, I don't know, is that an indication that a lot of the spread is partly down to people going out into Europe and going further overseas and coming back into the country? If so, then a lot more needs to happen at the border, doesn't it? El, thank you. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Love to hear from you this morning. Again, if you've been struggling to get a test, what does need to change in that process in order to make it slicker, more efficient, and to change your life around? Let's speak to Tobias Elwood, Chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, Conservative MP for Bournemouth East. Thank you for being there for us, Mr Elwood, this morning. Let's start with test and trace then. I wonder what you make of the fact that we're contemplating a second lockdown, and whether that is an indication that the ability the government has to manage this just hasn't worked.
I think absolutely testing is critical. You need to have an intelligence picture of what's going across the nation, and people will be very concerned, just as Esther expressed there, about the prospect of a second lockdown. But I do believe we're in a different place compared with April, and this is where I think the government needs to have a more educated approach. We are in a different place. All of us are treating this with much more discipline. We're wearing our masks. We're doing our social distancing much better. And this is now hitting a different age profile. So I pose the question rather than having the answers, because I don't have all the information that Sage has presented. But is it right that we go for this ruthless, draconian lockdown and follow exactly what we did last time? Or do we learn the lessons from the last few months and actually say we need to be able to absolutely continue to try and suppress this pandemic, but also do better to live with it? If we can continue shielding those people who are vulnerable, if we can make sure those death numbers don't increase, we can make sure that those entries to hospitals stay low, then perhaps we can actually advance this. If you and I get ill, we should immediately go home, separated ourselves. But does that mean that there should be lockdowns in your and our areas? That's the question I pose.
Well, just on that then, I wonder how responsible it may have been, not only to allow those who are shielding out a couple of months or so ago, at the start of August, wasn't it? And also to encourage in the way that the government has done to get people back to work. They've been absolutely banging that drum as hard as they possibly can. Was it too much too soon?
Well, I think there's going to be lots of questions asked about what happened in the past. But like I said, we do need to learn from that and move forward. Absolutely.
What's your view?
There's more that could have been done. I visited care homes and they felt neglected at the very start. There isn't that connectivity between our care home sector as there is with hospitals, and that may have been part of it. But ultimately, we should now revisit the care home sector to make sure, are they getting the PPE? Are they shielding correctly? Are they following those procedures? Are we all doing our part to make sure anybody, whether they're in a care home or indeed at home are doing what we can to make sure they don't get ill. But you lead to another point, which is our testing infrastructure. Absolutely, this needs to be ratcheted up, not only for the peace of mind, so we can all understand where we sit, but also to better understand what is happening across the nation. Are we going to follow Spain and France? Mercifully, we're not seeing that jump in the number of deaths. Now, if that's the case, more people are dying of flu today than they are of COVID-19. Should we be advancing our thoughts on how we deal with this until that magic vaccine changes our lives back to normal?
Well, let me ask you about that test and trace infrastructure, because you were at the liaison committee earlier in the week in front of the Prime Minister talking about military involvement in that test and trace process. What specifically do you want to see the military do?
Well, firstly, I think there's a capacity issue in Whitehall. I'll be very blunt about this. Any government would be tested by what we're going through. But this government, number 10, is having to deal with the ongoing issues of any day running the country. You've also got the pandemic itself, an enduring emergency. This isn't just a one-off Cobra and then we get back to normal. Then we have the economic impact of this as well. And then there's the wider picture of the geopolitical changes that are taking place, with the threats from Russia and China. Lots going on in number 10. How can you manage that? You've got to increase the capacity. You've got to have better decision-making, swifter decision-making. Once you've made decisions, then the actual operational delivery needs to perhaps be passed to a different group of people rather than policy people who have no experience in running
private companies.
Crises. I'm sorry?
Or private companies. A lot of people very critical about some of the companies that have been involved in testing. Would you rather see that go to the military to do?
It's ironic that in Conservatives, naturally, we don't run things. We outsource this to people that can. So absolutely, what you do is you take the best experience. That's what we did in the Second World War. We don't try to run these things ourselves. The military, going back to that, are the best strategic planners we have in the country, because they actually plan for crises. They look prepare for enduring emergencies. But from what I understand, there's almost a stigma attached to them being in the room to help plan for over-the-horizon thinking. That's what I'd like to see brought in. Not only the logistics and the transport, the Nightingale's hospitals, which have been absolutely fantastic, but ultimately, we hear from Matt Hancock this morning, a vaccine is not coming for months and months and months. We need to be better at learning how to live with this pandemic, but making sure our economy can actually continue to go. A national lockdown, would be catastrophic for Britain.
Let me read to you some of the quotes that are in the newspapers from some of your colleagues, unnamed Conservative MPs, about what they see as the decision making coming from number 10 at the moment. Quotes: they want to see the economy as open as possible and are growing increasingly tired of what they see as Johnson's incompetence. No one is likely to make a move against the Prime Minister now, but if the polls start slipping and get to about 35%, everyone is going to start panicking. Another here: Boris was elected as leader because they thought he would win an election and would deliver Brexit. Once Brexit is done, that is one less thing going in his favour. If it also looks like he might be an electoral liability, then I can't see how he survives. I wonder if you're picking up a sense from some of your colleagues, or indeed yourself, that Mr Johnson might be in a spot of trouble.
Well, I think the spot of trouble that we're in is facing a new chapter of COVID-19. I'm not going to make comments on particular views on the Prime Minister. What I want to do is encourage the Prime Minister to recognise that there are skill sets available. I mentioned the armed forces as well. Increase the capacity there. Let's improve the communications, because unless all of us play our part, then this actual pandemic will continue to spread. So that daily briefings, I thought, were very successful. Prime Minister is one of the best communicators we have. And when he's up there on the number 10 briefings, people listen, but they've stopped now. We need to continue that, because there is a constant changing messaging here of what's going on. That's what I'd like to see.
Tobias Elwood, you're chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, Conservative MP for Bournemouth East. Thank you for coming on the programme this morning. 0345 6060 973 is the number. I wonder what you make of what Mr Elwood was suggesting around Mr Johnson being the best communicator that the government has, and therefore he should be out there more often trying to deliver a straightforward message. They keep saying the rule of 6 is very clear, that you can't have more than 6 people together, apart from those circumstances where you can, whether it's sporting events like grousing. I mean, I don't know who's going grousing this weekend. I'm sure you're absolutely delighted that you're able to do it, but there aren't many of us who will want to go grousing. And I wonder, in that context, whether actually the fact that children still count as part of the 6 when they don't have to wear masks. Doesn't that need to be looked at? Doesn't that need to be changed? 0345 6060 973. Come on to your thoughts about testing as well. We'll speak to the Executive Chair of the National Care Association, Nadra Ahmed, in a few moments' time as well. Swarbrick on Sunday here, 11:30. Let's get some news headlines first. Thomas Watts.
The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has warned the government will be increasingly stringent on people who aren't following coronavirus rules. From a week on Monday, anyone in England who refuses an order to self-isolate could face a fine of up to £10,000. Labour is calling on ministers to entrust coronavirus testing to local authorities and give school children priority access. The party's holding an online event in place of its annual conference, which was cancelled because of the pandemic. A man's suffered potentially life-changing injuries after a stabbing attack outside a pub in Plymouth. 5 people are in hospital after the altercation last night, which officers are not treating as terror-related. And the weather, most areas fine, warm and dry for the rest of the day. Cloudy across the far north of Scotland and parts of northeast England. A high of 25 Celsius.
This is
Conditions apply.
Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster on LBC.
Here's Peter on 84850 this morning. Morning, Peter. Tom, what Sweden is doing can be done here. Yes, our population is much larger, but then we just have to increase our facilities to be equal to Sweden. It just basically shows the government's lack of competence in tackling this epidemic. What about the army, says Peter? Can't they also be used? Well, it reflects some of the comments that Tobias Elwood has just made, and also that Sir David King, former Chief Scientific Advisor, Chair of Independent Sage, was telling us a little earlier. To be honest with you, Peter, I can't see why you wouldn't. Why wouldn't you involve the military in this? They as Tobias Elwood was saying, they plan for these kinds of processes all the time. That's what they're paid to do. Let's roll them out again. I'll speak to Nadra Ahmed in just a moment, the Executive Chair of the National Care Association. I want to talk about testing as well, how you've struggled to get a test, what that means for you. Ahmed is in New Malden. Hi, Ahmed.
Good morning, Tom. I hope it's, morning, 1 hour wait is worth the comment here, important comment, is that 6 months, it's shocking that 6 months down the road, and we are still faced with a total failure of testing. There's no testing going on at all. My daughter, she works for NHS, she has cough symptoms and so on, she can't get a test. Not only that,
I thought if she's frontline, Ahmed, she should be able to get. She should be prioritised.
Yeah,
should be
exactly.
Being prioritised.
All the government NHS websites are totally collapsed. They crashed. You can't get on it for love or money. Not
so
only
how
that,
long has your daughter been having these symptoms, Ahmed? How long has she had these symptoms for, and how long has she been?
It's about a week and a half now.
Yeah.
She's been told she has to stay away from work for 14 days. Not only that, the government has failed since March. They have continuously failed on every opportunity to introduce much more stricter and effective controls. Hence, we are now facing with a virus spreading just uncontrolled everywhere. More than nearly a million people were allowed to come into the country.
Level. Hang on a sec, Ahmed. We're not at the same level. We're not at the same level that we were back in March and April, thank goodness. You talk about people coming in. I mean, that's the term and the phrase that Boris Johnson used. I wonder whether it relates to
it's not that,
those coming into the country.
People are already here who brought that with them. Nearly a million people were allowed to come in the last 2-3 months. Now, still there are no checks at port of entry, whether it's seaport or airports. People are just coming in, bringing in whatever they like, but also, of course, the control. There is no testing and tracing of clusters, where it's happening, local areas.
It's not to say, Ahmed, and I appreciate the difficulty. Sorry to talk over you, but I appreciate the difficulty with your daughter, and that is not great. If you've got an NHS worker who can't get a test, that is really not good. But it's not to say there has been no testing. It is, true to say that they're testing more than other countries in Europe right now. It's just not enough. Ahmed, thank you. 0345 6060 973. I wish your daughter the best. Let's turn to Nadra Ahmed, Executive Chair of the National Care Association. Nadra, thank you for coming on the programme this morning. Good to have you with us. Clearly, protecting care homes and the care settings are massively critical in this. I wonder if you've seen an increase in protection being offered.
Well, I think we've had the winter plan published over the weekend, and we have had the infection prevention control fund that was announced some time ago, which comes to the end in September. And so we've had a continuation of that, which includes free PPE. So there are some measures that have come through. So 600 million was what was announced for the sector to support us through this. And that's the only bit of money that's hit the front line. And it's been very welcome. So an additional amount that brings it over to 1 billion is really helpful. I think what we are really struggling with as a sector is, we have a workforce issue. Of course, we've got 122,000 vacancies in our sector as things stand. But additionally, the chaos that has ensued around the testing, it's not about the tests being delivered to the homes and for the staff to take the tests, but it's about when they're collected by the couriers to be analysed and the time it's taking. I can't tell you the anxiety within care homes as they are waiting for those results. And then if something
How long
comes
is it
back,
taking?
Well, an average that I've had from my mailbox is around 6 days, between 5 and 6 days, which is
and that's a whole
time
batch
for them
of
to
tests.
do the second one. Yeah, it's a whole batch of tests. So 100 tests might go off from a care home. The courier might collect them the day that they're supposed to, or sometimes they're not collecting them on the day that they're supposed to, which actually also creates an issue. We had one provider tell us that they had a courier turn up at 1:30 in the morning, which is fine because we're a 24-hour service. That the only challenge was that the tests had actually been picked up at 9 o'clock the night before. So there is this challenge around how it's all working.
Can I ask you who is it that's doing the couriering? Is it a private enterprise? Is it connected to the testing? Whose job is it to do that?
It's the laboratories. It's the laboratories, as I understand it, that are going to then analyse the tests. So that it's being done. It's Public Health England who are kind of doing all of this. I mean, it's quite difficult for us to get to the bottom of it. It's who do we ring and where do we ring, because nobody really wants to give us a straight answer. But the important point in all of this is, because we're looking after some of the most vulnerable people, the people who should be shielded, it's really critical for us to be able to have a testing pattern that is consistent. actually, as we start looking at the winter plans, and there is still this conversation going on around discharge out of hospitals into care homes, we've got to really be clear about this, because only today I've had a message to say that somebody's taken somebody out of hospital with a negative test result. They've done the test result and sent it off, and they've got it back 4 days later. Fortunately, this home isolated the person, but it's a positive.
Oh.
So we've got to be confident that the results we're getting. So we're telling all providers, if you are going to go down this pathway of taking people out of hospital, even if it's with a negative, you must isolate them and redo the test. Now, all of this is quite challenging, Tom.
Oh, I bet it is. It sounds incredibly stressful for you and your colleagues. When it comes on to testing, and we've seen the government say a lot of people without symptoms are getting tests unnecessarily, about 27%. Is it the case that in care homes, any resident or any member of staff, because of the job that they do, can get a test whether they're asymptomatic or not, whether they're displaying the symptoms or not?
Well, we have the test delivered to our homes, so all our staff can have a test every week, once
regardless
a week.
Regardless of their health condition at the time, they just test and test and test and test.
Yeah, but the residence is once a month, which is quite a big gap. So we've got to be careful about that. And
in that regard, sorry to cut across you, Nadra, but in that regard, if I wanted to go and see my family member in a care home, what's the process of making sure that me coming from home or driving around or whatever, having been to work all week, can come in and see my elderly aunt or my elderly grandma or granddad? What allows me to come in and do that at the moment, or not?
Well, we're carrying out very, very stringent risk assessments of every single resident in the service to make sure what their actual situation medically is, and how what the risk is attached to them getting the virus. We know it's risk, some people be more than others. We're also depending on families to give us accurate details of movements and giving us disclaimers, as well as information about their not having been in touch with them. Have you been to the pub? People don't want to answer the questions. They don't want to tell us if they've been to the pub yesterday, because it might make a difference, and it would make a difference, because providers would be very concerned. We've got to keep not only one person safe, we've got to keep the whole home safe, and we've got to keep the and our staff safe. So that it's all got to match. District nurses are coming into our services who are not able to access tests on a regular basis. CQC inspectors are coming into our services, and they have a right to. They're not being tested. So we're very exposed at this moment in time.
Incredibly worrying, isn't it? Nadra, thank you. Nadra Ahmed, Executive Chair of the National Care Association. Thank you for coming on the programme this morning. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Let's go to Kent. Here's Sarah in Gravesend. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Tom. How are you?
I'm good, thank you very much. Tell me about the difficulties of testing.
Luckily, I haven't had to have a test myself yet, and any members of my family, but I do work within the NHS, so I'm obviously aware of the details of testing, etc. I just think sometimes the message hasn't been particularly clear. I think we were encouraged, obviously, for anyone to get a test at one point, and then we were all encouraged, to go out, eat out, help out, etc. And now we're being told only people who are symptomatic to have a test. I think sometimes the boundaries seem to change quite quickly, and I think that's where the confusion lies. I think people get one set of sort of rules, as it were, and so we're just getting to that sort of mode, and then it's changed again. So I think people sort of get used to what they're doing, and then it's reversed again. And I think we just need to have sort of just a clear message and stick to it, really.
Yes, well, that would be ideal. Of course, the times change, and what we understand about the virus change, and the spread of the virus changes. But Sarah, I'll come back to a point I made a little earlier, actually, about Professor Neil Ferguson, the man, professor from Imperial College, who did the modelling, and who was on SAGE until he lost his position on SAGE because he flouted the lockdown rules. He was saying that the demand in testing was completely unanticipated by anybody when schools went back. So nobody, according to Professor Neil Ferguson, thought that maybe it was a good idea to look at what might happen if kids going to school came back home from school with a cough and a cold, and what would happen if mum and dad decided to try and get a test for them. I mean, I find that absolutely astonishing.
I think it's quite obvious that obviously when children, especially they've been out of school for 6 months, are going to be returning to school, that naturally they're going to go back, they're going to pick up the normal bugs and colds and etc. So I would automatically assume that the tests, the need for tests will probably improve, because not everyone is confident of what, although I believe this, the symptoms seem very clear of what coronavirus is, not everyone maybe understands that particularly well. So obviously,
yes, and they change as well. Of course, they're updated and they change based on the science too, which makes it a little bit more complicated.
This is the problem I think we're having. I think I'm just getting frustrated with the unclear messages. I think we just need a real clear message and stick to it. This is what I find frustrating. And obviously, there's a talk of another lockdown, and that's quite scary, from an economic purpose, when people are trying to get back their livelihoods and their, get their lives back on track. And obviously,
it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking, Sarah. It's heartbreaking for the people who run pubs, particularly in that hospitality industry, which I'm afraid looks like it's going to be the first hit if an entire industry is going to be hit. I'm afraid it looks like that one, doesn't it? And you're right about protecting the vulnerable and protecting care homes, as we've just discussed. Sarah, thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for your call as well. 0345 6060 973. More to come. Plus,
my question to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor is, why are you not stepping up to the plate to protect British workers?
Len McCluskey, the leader of Unite, on the Labour Party, what Boris Johnson is getting wrong, and his relationship with Keir Starmer, which has at times been rather testy. We'll hear from Len in a few moments. Tom Swarbrick here, it's 11:46.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, LBC.
I want us all to look to Sweden. They kept their schools open. They kept their businesses open. If you go by the Imperial College numbers, they should have lost 85,000 people. When I looked last night, 5,851. To their economy, it's dropped 8.6%. Spain, which had among the fiercest lockdowns in Europe, tops the league of second wave infection. Where do you suppose Sweden is? Bottom. Isn't there something to learn from the Swedish example?
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, weekday mornings from 7, LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Morning to you. Welcome to the programme. If you've just joined us, having a lazy Sunday morning, you can, of course, watch us as well. Global Player, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. We're all over the place. Here's Ab on 84850. Tom, people should be restricted to one test every 2 weeks. Many people are abusing the system and having multiple tests. Ab says the British public are a disgrace. You're dealing with people who don't respect the system. We need Boris to be tough and have zero tolerance. I ask, what would Maggie Thatcher have done? Said Ab. Well, you must be in agreement with the idea that people are going to be fined up to £10,000 for breaking the self-isolation rules. We'll speak to Johnny in just a few moments. I want to bring you this, though, from the Labour conference, which is underway this weekend, a virtual Labour conference. We'll speak about it in more detail after the news at 12. Alistair Campbell will join us. We'll speak to Len McCluskey, the leader of Unite 2. Want to play you this. It's from the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, speaking at the conference this morning. Take a listen.
Last Wednesday, at Prime Minister's Questions, I faced a Prime Minister who pretends he's a man of the people, but has shown his contempt for women and the working class. As a single mum, he said my children would grow up ill-raised, ignorant and illegitimate. He only knows one approach, denying that problems exist and then blaming other people for his own incompetence. We are facing a second spike, further restrictions and the prospect of another national lockdown because of his failure and incompetence. Infections are rising. The testing system is collapsing, and the government has lost control of the virus because they have failed to deliver an effective test, track and trace system.
That's Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, in the last few moments. Interesting that Keir Starmer's been talking about being constructive as an opposition. Now, obviously, they have disagreements with how Boris Johnson is doing that. I wonder how much that was constructive. Johnny's in Tottenham. Hi, Johnny.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Now, we were talking a little earlier about the couriering of tests. That's something you're involved in. Tell us how.
Yeah, Tom, I'm actually delivering tests as we speak. And I've got 10 on for today. And I'm actually waiting for the customer to do the test, which takes about 10 minutes, and then collecting it straight away and then taking it back to the lab.
And when you say you're doing 10 runs of how many tests and to where, Johnny?
10 separate tests, so 10 separate addresses.
Wow. One individual test at that address?
Yes.
Oh, that's a lot of work for not many tests done.
It is a lot of work. The ladies said earlier that the tests are not being picked up till the next day or two, but as I said, the courier company I'm working for, we are actually delivering the tests, waiting for the customer to do the test, and then collecting the test, and then taking it back to the lab within about 4 or 5 hours.
And do you mind me asking, don't give away too many details if you don't want to, but who are the kinds of people that you're taking tests to?
Frontline workers, children, people that are going away on holiday.
People that are going away on holiday? Are they, when you knock on the door, Johnny, are they sort of coughing and spluttering their way to the door, dragging themselves out of bed, not feeling particularly well? Or if you're going on holiday, you're not going to go on holiday in that condition, are you?
No, I knock on the door. They get a notification when I'm about a minute or two away. I put a test on the doormat, step away. So, social distancing. They obviously pick the test up, take it in, do what they've got to do. Bring it back out, leave it on the doorstep. Obviously, I'm wearing gloves and PPE.
Yeah, and this is part of the NHS system, John. You're not part of a private company that people pay to have delivered tests.
I think it is possibly part. I think it is private, to be honest, Tom.
Right. I was going to say, it sounds fantastic that you can call someone up, get a test delivered at your door, they wait outside and take it away again. That sounds like a brilliant system, although I don't think that's the system that many millions of people get access to.
As you know, it's not free.
No.
The tests, I think they pretty much are private tests. People do have to pay for them, but I just wanted to phone up and, with the lady who said that the couriers are not picking them up until a couple of days later. Maybe that's true, but on my courier company, we're actually waiting for the tests to be completed. And then, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, they bring them out, leave them on the doorstep. We pick them up and off to the next stop, do the same.
And you do, Johnny, is it mainly individuals or schools, care homes?
Sometimes there might be 5 tests going to one house, so the whole family. Today I've got all the addresses, they're just individual tests. It varies really, Tom.
Yeah. But you are saying, I mean, I guess if you're paying for it privately, then the government's saying to you only get it if you're symptomatic. You might think, well, right, I'll do what I want with my money, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah.
You're still clocking up the labs, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's just a shame that if you do want a test, you have to pay for it.
Well, quite. I mean, that is good. Although, as you say, Johnny, thank you, by the way. It's interesting to get straight out there onto the ground, as it were. But you talk about it not being free. I think I saw somewhere that the cost of a test was about £100 at the moment, and that the whole scheme has been offered £10 billion. I mean, it's not free, even if it's publicly provided. We're going to have to pay for it at some stage. Johnny, thank you. Julia's a new caller to the programme in Darlington this morning. Hiya, Julia.
Hello there.
Hello.
Well, test and trace, I do believe in it. I don't believe in blaming anybody for things going wrong. I wish it was more freely available, but you've got to keep on top of the virus. And my concern today is about the Halloween approaching, and lots of masks are hanging up on pegs and shelves that children are able to reach, and they're trying them on and putting them back on pegs. So I would like to see shops putting them out of reach of children or behind the counters, because it could spread quite quickly.
This is a very specific concern, Julia, but in shops that sell masks for Halloween, that a child would pick them up, put them on, sneeze into it, whatever, and then stick it back. Yeah.
Yes, well, I wouldn't know if they sneeze, but there used to be
Are there lots of those shops in Darlington?
Darlington, County Durham, yes.
Yeah. And are there lots of those shops around there? You're getting worried about it because there are loads of them on offer.
It's the Halloween season now, so they're coming back out everywhere. It's not just Darlington. I think about the whole country is a concern. I've worked down south as well.
Well, I agree that it shouldn't be happening. Yeah, it shouldn't be happening in those shops anywhere, really, should it? I think there are some certainly clothes shops. You're not allowed to try the clothes on in the store or anything like that. That would seem sensible, wouldn't it?
And masks and everything, because it's straight onto the child's face, and they're not wearing masks anyway, and it's straight onto the child's face and then onto another child's face. So I think they should be put out of reach and then taken off.
When you talk, Julia, just very briefly about not blaming people, or you wish that people weren't talking about blame so much, what do you make of the idea that 1 in 5 tests are asked for by people who are not displaying any symptoms, and the stat we heard earlier about not enough people are self-isolating?
Well, it's the nature of people. Some people are going to be worried about things and some people aren't. The tests only...
But do you not think there's an element of blame that could be placed at those people? I mean, if you're rung up by someone from a contact tracing centre and said, oh, I'm really sorry, but you might have come into contact with somebody who's got it, and you literally don't bother, you just go, I'll carry on as normal. Who do you blame there?
Well, you take notice of what people say and do the best you can to follow the rules and not be able to spread it yourself. And when you're wearing masks and gloves and everything, I think it's less likely. If you're taking the regulations seriously, then it's less likely you're going to spread or pick up the disease anyway. The tests are only up to that point and to that day. People have been very lax about flu and cold bugs. People are working behind the counters in shops with colds and flus. This virus gets on board with that and on with the sneezes, because I believe it's a dry virus. It's a cough and dry virus. But if it gets into the nasal passages and spreads with flus, it's going to spread a lot more thoroughly and a lot more quickly. And I think people should be more considerate about colds and flus and working in shops.
Well, they absolutely are. I mean, that is one of the things that people are most concerned about, is people spreading it around in that manner, hence the mask. Julia, thank you. We have to leave it there. We're coming up very quickly to the news at midday, after which...
When the government's notched up 12 U-turns and rising, the only conclusion is serial incompetence. That serial incompetence is holding Britain back.
Labour now joint in the polls with Conservatives as their conference gets underway. We'll talk about their prospects amongst the public and at a potential general election in a few years' time. Is Sir Keir Starmer really going to be the next Prime Minister? Plus,
we take the tough calls. All he does is sit on the sidelines and carp, Mr. Speaker.
The man who currently is under pressure seemingly from his own side at the way in which the government has handled certainly test and trace over the last few weeks. Boris Johnson, we understand, in number 10 right now, coming up with a plan to be announced in the coming days that could see large parts of England placed under another lockdown.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at midday, the Health Secretary has warned coronavirus restrictions will get tougher if people don't stick to the rules. Matt Hancock's again refused to rule out the possibility of a second national lockdown. From the end of the month, people in England with COVID-19 who fail to self-isolate could be fined up to £10,000. Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC the government should avoid blaming the public.
I'm certainly one who would support stronger enforcement against people who are, very directly breaking what's being asked of them. So, yeah, I'm not shying away from that. But I don't think we need to turn this whole thing about that, because they're a very small minority, in my view, and the majority of people are following the rules.
Under the new measures, people on benefits in England will be eligible for a support payment of £500 if they have to self-isolate. Labour's deputy leader says the party will be campaigning on jobs, jobs, jobs in the months ahead. Angela Rayner has delivered a virtual party conference speech online. She's called for a guaranteed pay rise for care workers in England, describing low wages as a moral outrage. 5 people are now known to have been hurt following an attack outside a pub in Plymouth. 3 men were stabbed and 2 women were hit by a vehicle last night. It's not being treated as terror-related. A man is being questioned on suspicion of attempted murder. Donald Trump has promised to put forward a nominee for the US Supreme Court before November's election. Democrats say any replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died on Friday, should wait until after the presidential poll. Westminster Abbey is holding a memorial service to mark 80 years since the Battle of Britain. The Prime Minister is among fewer than 100 guests attending the scaled-back event. A flypast is planned for the end of the service. Historian and former RAF officer John Nichol says the battle was a turning point in the Second World War.
It was dicey on a couple of occasions. I never like to say if something had happened, then something else would have been the result. But I think that you can safely say that if we had not won that Battle of Britain 80 years ago, we would have seen a very, very, very different result in the war.
And the weather, most areas fine, warm with plenty of sunshine, cloudier across the far north of Scotland and parts of northeast England, a high of 25 Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Thomas.
App. This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good afternoon to you. Just gone midday this Sunday afternoon. You're listening to and possibly even watching Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC. Good to have you with us this afternoon. We've talked a lot, of course, about the new measures that may be about to come into force here in England as a result of the cases increasing. Obviously massively concerning. I want to come away from the health impact of it, the economic impact of it, the business impact, and just look at the nakedly political impact of the coronavirus and how it's being managed at the moment. Sir Keir Starmer, in a lot of the papers this morning ahead of the Labour Party conference, which is happening now in a virtual capacity because, of course, corona, he is across a lot of the papers talking about his leadership style, what people could gain from his leadership style, that he wants to be a constructive leader of the opposition working with the government, but also saying that the government is useless. It means, well, some of it anyway, that he is level in in the polls with the Conservative Party. They are both now neck and neck on 38%. That is before a supposed conference bounce, which does tend to happen if a conference goes well to a particular political party. So I wonder to what extent your view of Sir Keir Starmer has changed, your view of the Labour Party has changed as it changes, and whether or not you would consider him a Prime Minister in waiting. 0345 6060 973 is the number, 84850 to text, tweet at LBC. You'll hear from Len McCluskey a bit later this hour, the leader of Unite. First, Alistair Campbell joins us, author, former Director of Communication Strategy for Prime Minister Tony Blair between 1997 and 2003. Alistair, welcome to the programme this afternoon. Thank you for being there.
My pleasure.
What does Keir Starmer need to change from what went before him?
Well, I think, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, I think, went through a very, very bad period. I think we lost touch with that section of the population that you have to win over to win. And so Keir, in a sense, has got to win back people that Labour lost, but also win back, you've got to appeal right across the board. And I think what he's done so far, in very difficult circumstances, because Brexit and COVID have been so dominating in the debate, but I think he's established himself as the leader pretty well. I think he's been very, very good up against Johnson in Parliament, which is not to be underestimated. And I think the next steps, I think the team has got to become much more visible and much more recognised by the public and appreciated by the public. And then the big thing for me is then the forward policy agenda. Once hopefully we get through COVID, we get whatever mess emerges from the Brexit process, that we get through that, and Labour then has to start to have that agenda for the future. So I think he's made a very, very good start, but don't underestimate how difficult it is being leader of the opposition.
Yeah. Well, David Cameron once called it the worst job in politics to be leader of the opposition, and he ultimately ended up being successful in that he became Prime Minister. You talk about appealing to the section of the population that you need to win over in order to be successful. I wonder how much you think the population, or those people who maybe went from Conservative or Labour to Conservative at the last election, Brexit voters, will forgive Keir Starmer for taking a position of second referendum and Remain. Do you think that will be an issue by the time 2024 rolls around?
I doubt it, and look, it may be for some. I think, I think when you look, if Brexit gets done, if Brexit sort of takes the sort of path that I think it will, then I think actually that could put Keir Starmer in a much stronger position. But the point is that when I talk about winning over people, I'm not talking about winning over political obsessives. I'm talking actually about people who probably aren't listening to this. I'm talking about people who don't spend their whole time kind of,
Everyone's listening to this, Alistair. Come on.
They're not. Once I finish this, I'm getting back on my bike. A lot of people don't follow it so closely. So what they will want, if and when we get to the next general election, assuming it's Starmer against Johnson, which I'm, increasingly beginning to doubt, but assuming it's Starmer-Johnson, then I think people want to say, well, is that guy a credible Prime Minister? And I think he's definitely establishing himself as that. Is his team a credible cabinet? Well, the bar on that is going to be pretty low, given the cabinet that we've got at the moment. And then most importantly, as I keep saying, what are the big things that he's saying about the future? And that's the bit where I think at the moment, for reasons I understand, namely, what's the point about talking about your big ideas on education, on health, when actually what everybody's talking about is COVID and Brexit? So he will have time for that, but I think that's the kind of unknown at this stage.
Yes, and it's clearly not enough, is it, to that particular electorate to just look like you're not incompetent. Clearly competence is a big thing. That is what he seems to have gone on. He comes across as across the detail and aware of what he's doing, and as you say, PMQs works quite well for him, but he needs a lot more than that. If you were advising him now, where would you want him to start? And I guess the question is, this is the unknowable answer really, but when? As you say, at the moment, trying to find the airwave space to talk about your future agenda is almost impossible.
Well, that's why. I mean, look, it is really, really unfortunate for the Labour Party that something like the party conference, which is one of the few moments in the political calendar when you really feel you can connect with the population as a whole, that it's happening in this virtual space when I suspect it's going to be very, very hard for them to punch through. And, if it's true, for example, that Johnson's making an address to yet another one of his ridiculous home videos to the nation on Tuesday, that's going to kind of wipe out one of Labour's
speaking
biggest
from his
days.
bicycle.
Yeah, but I'm not the bloody Prime Minister, Tom, okay? So my point is that, I do think that Keir projecting himself as a serious, detailed, focused politician is a very, very important thing to do, particularly because of the way that Johnson operates. But as you say, it's not enough. So the question for me is, you do it all the time. You've got to be out there campaigning and fighting all the time. The question is, when do you pick the really big moments where you can get through to the public? And in a sense, the answer to that is you do it when you plan to do it. And I hope that the Labour Party, as you say, understands that it's not enough for the Tories to be useless. They've also got to, when we talk about the Brexit argument, and maybe I'm, perhaps the last person that people want to hear this from because of my kind of quite extreme views. Even Keir Starmer, even Keir Starmer would probably say I was a bit extreme on Brexit, and I still am. However, I think that what the people who voted Brexit, in a way, Keir Starmer has got to show not tell in a way. He's got to show them not just that he can be a Prime Minister, but also that he gets why they're like they are. He gets their world, he gets their lives. One of the most extraordinary things that's happened in this kind of populist era is that Donald Trump, daddy's boy billionaire, and Boris Johnson, an Oxford Oldetonian Daily Telegraph reporter, have managed to present themselves as the voices of the people against the elite when they are the elite, and they're actually working against the interests of the people.
And Sir Keir Starmer is definitely the elite. Barrister, director, former director of public prosecutions, knight of the realm. Lives in Islington.
Yes, I know that, but you say that. Well, the first thing to say about Islington, and one of the, it's actually, as well as being a fairly wealthy part of the world, it's also one of the poorest parts of the world for quite a lot of people. And Keir's background, actually, this is why I think the more that he does need to get out there with his backstory a bit, because actually he is from a genuinely kind of working class background. So I know why the Tories will try to play that, and I know why the Jeremy Corbyn supporters keep doing this Sir Keir thing and all the rest of it. All I'd say to both sides is grow up and actually understand that being the leader of the Labour Party at this time is one of the most important positions in the country. And I think we've got to give Keir the space and time to project himself because it is, in the end, I hate all the sort of personality stuff, but I'm afraid in the modern age you do have to do that. It's part of the job that you have to do. And I think Keir has a very good backstory and I actually think a lot of these people, they will like the idea more of competence. And he was a very good DPP. He was, by all accounts, my brother-in-law worked with him in the same chambers. He was, by all accounts, a very, very good lawyer. He's got something pretty special about him to have gone from being an MP a few years ago now to being the leader of the Labour Party. He's clearly not to be underestimated.
Well, arguably, because he argued for a position to have a second referendum that the Labour Party should campaign on in a general election that was about Brexit. He advocated that in shadow cabinet, and it absolutely destroyed them.
Well, I don't accept that. You see, and if anything,
I know you don't.
No, but I think honestly, I think this is just a really lazy rewriting of history by the Corbynistas, who want to believe that it wasn't down to the fact that we elected somebody who was unelectable. And that's why the other thing...
Let me just push you on the manifestos then, because I'll speak to Len McCluskey about this a bit later.
Yeah.
But on the 2017... And Len McCluskey is a massively important figure in the Labour Party anyway, and actually probably as a result of conference being virtual and the coffers not being as swollen as they might have otherwise been, becomes increasingly important. I asked him about the manifestos. He talks about that 2017 and 2019 manifestos were very popular. They were the popular things. They were the things that nearly propelled Jeremy Corbyn into number 10 in 2017. Do you think that Keir Starmer would be wise to take large chunks of those things as the basis of whatever vision he has for the coming years as Prime Minister?
Look, it's always popular. If you say you're going to eradicate child poverty, that is popular. If you say that you're going to deliver a better water service, better health service, better everything service, that is popular. The question is, was it credible? And until look, I just wish people would forget what's happened. I mean, learn from it, but learn the right lessons. One of the most extraordinary things recently, if I'm allowed to mention rival radio stations, one of which did that Twitter poll about who was the best Prime Minister we never had. And Jeremy Corbyn won it because the Corbynistas obviously organised him to win it. And he made victory acceptance speech. Labour lost. And let me tell you, and maybe say this to Len McCluskey as well. The last 11 general elections, 11, have gone as follows. Tory, 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 Blair, 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 Tory, 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 Tory. Now, we have to learn from that. We keep losing when we don't connect with these people, unfortunate though it is for you to hear this, Tom, who don't listen to LBC all day long because they've got other things to do with their lives.
I don't know who these people are, Alistair. Hey, listen, let me ask you this very finally, because I know you've got another book out at the moment, and one of the things I've done really rather sadly is I have listened to Tony Blair's reading of his book The Journey when I go for my jog, and I listen to it, and he talks very candidly about the stress on him and on you during your time in office, and you've been very candid about your own battles with mental health. I wonder to what extent your time in Number 10 and the pressure on you in that job and how public you became, what impact that had on your mental health later on in life?
Well, the new book that you mentioned has a chapter on that. It's about my mental health. It's about depression and how to kind of overcome depression, which most of the time I've managed to do, but I still get it. And I've written a chapter about the mental health implications of that job. My psychiatrist, for example, thinks that my mental health problems are driven by a kind of addiction to political life and political campaigns. And as soon as I go back into it, I dip again. I don't think Tony Blair... I think Tony was extraordinarily resilient in the job. His outlook on life is broadly always positive, which I think is a good thing. I think that's why we were quite a good yin and yang. I was always looking for things to go wrong, and he was always looking for them to go right. But I mean, reading all this stuff about Boris Johnson at the moment, I don't know if it's true or not, that he's not enjoying it and he's finding it very difficult and so forth. I mean, I don't have much sympathy for that, either with him or Cummings, because they've wanted this for so long, and I just think there does come a point in all of us where you have to have some self-awareness. I had the self-awareness after whatever it was, nearly a decade, to say you've got to get out of this. I think sometimes that is what your mental health tells you to do, and I don't know if that's the case with Johnson and Cummings or not, but I do think that they're making a very, very big hash of a hugely important job at a hugely important time.
Okay. I've been longing to say this for a long time. On your bike, Alistair. Thank you very much indeed. Alistair Campbell, author, former Director of Communications and Strategy for Prime Minister Tony Blair between 1997 and 2003. 0345 6060 973 is the number. If you are a former Labour supporter who, for whatever reason at the last election became a Conservative voter, is Keir Starmer the man to win you back? Is there a chance of him getting into Number 10, particularly with the difficulties that the Conservative Party under Johnson are having at the moment? 0345 6060 973. Plus,
currently we have major problems. The clock is ticking in relation to the job retention scheme.
Len McCluskey, the leader of Unite, on the programme in a couple of moments' time. You're watching and listening to Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC. It's 12:18.
This is LBC. space. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Here's a text on 84850 on the subject of whether Sir Keir Starmer is the man to improve Labour's chances at another general election, were that to happen in the next 4 years or so, if not possibly sooner. Text here, sorry, Tom. Your guests are making me angry. I was always a Labour supporter, but no more after Brexit. Alistair Campbell is still bleating about losing. Starmer does nothing but criticise the government. So boring. This texter says, Rayner, give me strength. Andy in Shepperton, Labour was level pegging with the Conservatives in polls weeks ago. The question is why, with all that is going on and a new leader, are Labour not further forward? Says it all, he says. Here's Robert in Southwell this morning. Hi, Robert.
Hello, mate. Keir Starmer, I think we need to have a broader look at who represents the country. And to be honest, who we've had in the past few years, either persuasion and their entourage, you know, the ministers, is all lawyers. We seem to just get lawyers.
Do we?
Hello?
David Cameron was. Hello? David Cameron wasn't a lawyer.
I know, but...
Theresa May wasn't a lawyer. Boris Johnson wasn't a lawyer. Isn't a lawyer.
But who was a lawyer?
Tony Blair was a lawyer.
Tony Blair was a lawyer.
Yep. So that's one. Was John Major a lawyer?
What I'm saying is, we need to represent... Yeah, but they seem to have ministers behind them that are all lawyers.
What's wrong with lawyers?
Well, because they don't represent the country.
Yeah, but if they're being elected to represent the... But, Robert, what is it about lawyers that isn't reflective of the country?
They talk straight when they're in opposition, and when they get into power, they have a sudden touch of amnesia when they're asked a question.
You think that they're slippery?
Oh, very slippery. Oh, my God. Life boy. Is
Sir Keir Starmer slippery?
Well, he hasn't been in power yet, but I should imagine he can be. He was in court, wasn't he?
Slagging off lawyers left, right and centre. I'd be careful doing that, Robert, as a tactic. Thank you for the call. Here's Vicky, new caller in Manchester. Hi, Vicky.
Hey there, Tom. How are you doing?
Hi. Yeah, good, thank you. What do you make of Sir Keir Starmer thus far?
Thus far, well, I just want somebody ultimately to be running the country who's competent to run the country and do the best possible job. I think Keir Starmer's doing a fantastic job in opposition at the moment. I think he just needs to stick close to his values, stick to the clear communications, stick to checking out the facts.
What are those values? What are the values that you think drive Keir Starmer?
I think he's looking at the bigger picture, greater good, ultimately, in terms of doing what's best for the country and sticking to
everyone is, aren't they? They all go into office saying that. Everyone goes in saying, no one campaigns on the slogan, I'm going to make the country worse.
I think he's looking at the greater, wider population. I mean, the Tories do a good talk about levelling up, but I think somebody like Keir Starmer would actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk. I think he deals less in the sort of nice little sound bites and actually has some substance behind what he's looking to deliver.
It's interesting, Vicky, you talk about competence. Thank you for the call, by the way. Apologies it's so short, but you talk a lot about competence there, and I think that is, Alistair Campbell talked about credible. It's not enough just to be seen as not incompetent, which I think Sir Keir Starmer's performances thus far have shown that he is competent and credible in the eyes of lots of the public, and he will make that contrast with the current government. But as you say, Vicky, there's got to be a bit more there. It's just the timing of when that's going to happen. Let's get more on these polls now. Lord Robert Hayward joins us, pollster, Conservative peer, who has had many successes with his polling. He predicted Thatcher's election victory and got the result of the referendum right. He also advised David Cameron in 2015 too. Lord Hayward, thank you for coming on the programme. What do you make of the polls as they currently state? Morning to you, at 38% apiece. What does that tell you about the state of British politics?
I think it says that Keir Starmer's made progress, but one shouldn't get too carried away with it on the basis that the Conservatives have now been in power for a decade, and he is making progress from an all-time low of Labour leadership in terms of Jeremy Corbyn's results in December 2019. So progress, he's playing it right to the extent that there isn't going to be an election for another 4 years or so. So he's got to do it steadily rather than be a single blast.
He pitches himself as the competence thing, but also trying to be constructive with the government. That I wonder if you think that is a deliberate strategy, because that's what people want. People want to see their opposition not just being opposition for the sake of it.
Oh, there's no question. It is a deliberate strategy. As I say, he has made progress. The significant thing about the polls is that actually there's a large proportion of the electorate who, when asked about Keir Starmer, say they don't know. And clearly his objective over the next few months, few years, is to get those people who are saying they don't know to fall on his side. He also has to be careful as to how he portrays himself, because, of course, there is no guarantee that the person he'll face at the next election will in fact be Boris Johnson.
Quite.
There are persistent stories that say that Boris Johnson may not want to or may choose. Now, Boris is saying, oh, yes, I'm going, and his people are saying, we're going to full time and I will be running for re-election. But Keir Starmer has to work on the basis that he has to project himself in such a way that it's both Boris that he's getting at, but also any potential other Conservative leader.
I wonder if Starmer fears Sunak rather more than he fears Johnson at the next general election, but that is a long way off for now. What about the point that a couple of people are making this afternoon that says, actually, given the state of the current government and the difficulties that they've had, he should be much further ahead?
I think that's true, and that's why I was cautious in my opening comments about saying that he can be pleased about the progress that he's made, but he shouldn't get bowled over by being roughly level with the Conservatives. As I said earlier, it's been 10 years of Conservative government, and all the Labour Party is at the moment is level pegging. That's not a position which will put the Labour Party in a great frame of mind.
What's your view on the public's view of his view of Brexit?
I'm not sure that people think that carefully about it, but I think when challenged, he's trying to ride two different horses. He's trying to ride the view of London and the South East, which is essentially Remain, while at the same time not upsetting the pro-Brexit former Labour voters in the Red Wall seats in the North and the Midlands and North Wales, who moved to the Tories at the last election and gave Boris his large majority. He's got a very difficult task, but I'm not sure that people really have thought about that much. What he doesn't want to do is provide too many hostages to fortune.
No, and I guess too, I don't know whether it helps him if Brexit is seen to have gone badly, and therefore he can pick up on the crowd who say, oh gosh, wasn't this a bad idea in the first place? And he can say, yep, I was the one arguing for that. Or whether it sort of goes, and in the next few years, by the next general election, we're now getting into the nitty-gritty of trade deals with various countries, which the majority of people probably aren't that interested in. Which suits him better, do you think? That it goes away or becomes more of an issue?
I think goes away. It then gives him the opportunity to project himself to the traditional Labour voters in the Midlands and the North and say the Tories haven't actually changed enough for you. His objective will be to hope that at some point it goes away and he can talk about other issues, whether they be education, the NHS, the state of the economy, or whatever it may happen to be. Because Rishi Sunak is very popular, because at the moment he's giving lots of money away. He's going to have some tough decisions to make at some stage or another. That is the point at which Keir Starmer will want to go on the question of the economy.
Lord Hayward, grateful to you. Thank you. Robert Hayward, pollster, Conservative peer, former advisor to David Cameron, as well as getting some of those big calls right, not least the referendum result. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Very keen to hear from you if you are in one of those so-called red wall seats that has gone a bit blue. Having voted for the Conservatives in 2019, what does Keir Starmer need to do and say to persuade you back? And does this referendum, second referendum Remain view of his have any impact whatsoever, or is it all water under the bridge now? It's all gone. 0345 6060 973. Your call's in just a moment. Plus,
my question to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor is, why are you not stepping up to the plate to protect British workers?
The leader of Unite, Len McCluskey. You'll hear from him after the news headlines, which at 12:30 on Swarbrick on Sunday come from Tim Humphrey.
From the end of this month, people in England with COVID-19 will be required to self-isolate by law. Those who refuse when they test positive or are identified by contact tracers will face fines of up to £10,000. Labour's virtual party conference is underway. What's usually a major event has been cancelled due to the pandemic. 5 people are now known to have been hurt following an attack in Plymouth. Police have confirmed 3 men were stabbed near a pub last night, while 2 women were hit by a vehicle. And 4 Battle of Britain planes have flown over central London to mark the 80th anniversary of the campaign. A socially distanced commemoration has been held at Westminster Abbey. The weather, most places warm and dry with plenty of sunshine, some cloud in Scotland and the northeast, a high of 25.
This is LBC. This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of Unite, the Union, in just a few moments to come here on Swarbrick on Sunday. I've just seen this in one of the papers. That regarding some of the measures that might come in as a result of whatever lockdown measures are brought in by the government over the coming days, I think a lot of people will end up being back at home and working. This idea of pushing people to the office, I don't think it's going to be happening over the coming weeks, given the case rise that we've seen. I've just seen this, though. There's a London council, Hammersmith and Fulham Council, who are apparently telling their staff that they are banned from smoking at their desks if they're working from home. Which, hang on, if you're a smoker and you can't nip out for a break now because you're not in the office, you don't have to, you can smoke at your desk. Who's your boss to tell you that you can't? You're at home. Mad, that. Kevin, is in Neath in South Wales. Hi there, Kevin.
Hello there, pronounced Archie. That's good afternoon in Welsh.
Good afternoon, Kevin.
Well,
tell us about Keir.
I got to say to you, Tom, you've done your apprenticeship. You're a good journalist.
Oh, Kevin, that's very kind.
Yeah, you're good. You're a straight guy, you know. But
I try my best.
On Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, they're still in a mess. Absolutely in a mess. They're all contradicting one or the other. But in my area, Nitho Parolbert and Abavan, Stephen Kinnock as my MP. You could, but years ago, my mother and father were Labour councillors. I was working in the steelworks. We were Labour through and through, you know. But this time...
And now?
Conservative. Without a doubt.
Why?
But, why? Because the Labour Party didn't know where it was on Brexit. The people of this country have voted and voted and voted in 8,000.
And do you think it will be an issue, Kevin? I mean, this is... do you think it's really going to be an issue, Brexit, in 2024 in the way that it clearly was in 2019 and still to some people feels that way now?
You're quite right. You're quite right, Tom. I think that that we're going away to... I think it'll forever stay with us, and the debate with the Ramonas will go on and on and on. But,
because I think it's more... Yeah, I think you're right, Kevin. I think it's more than just about the vote, actually. I think it's about a sort of form of identity and a belief in fairness. Listen, Kevin, I've got to leave it there. I'm grateful to you for your call and for your kind words. Thank you. 0345 6060 973. I mentioned it a little earlier on in the programme. Before we came on air this morning, I sat down with Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of Unite, on the day that the Labour Party conference gets underway in a virtual capacity, and of course with everything we're hearing about the possibility of lockdowns too. I started by asking Mr. McCluskey what he thought the implications of a second lockdown were for jobs. Take a listen.
Well, a second lockdown would obviously be extremely serious. We're already facing huge problems within the economy, and I think therefore the government are right to try and avoid a second lockdown, be more focused and more surgical in the particular areas, because currently we have major problems. And of course, just on that, the clock is ticking in relation to the job retention scheme that the government introduced, but are now talking about finishing it by the end of October. And that means that the consultation, the 45 days consultation that is needed to workers has already started, and many companies will be looking at whether or not they can continue without that financial support.
Have you made an assessment about how many jobs could be laid
millions.
off, or even your own members and supporters?
Well, there are millions of workers currently under the job retention scheme who frankly will be having sleepless nights, them and their families. And what angers me more than anything is German workers are not having sleepless nights. Neither are French or Spanish workers or Belgian or...
They're offered less, though, German workers. They're
No.
They are. Scheme. It's been extended, but...
No, they're not offered less. When it's coupled with various other elements within their system, then they're much better treated. And at the moment, they are... having a future that looks okay because their government has stepped up to the plate. And my question to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor is, why are you not stepping up to the plate to protect British workers? Once again, are we the poor relations of Europe?
Well, where would you prioritise that? Because as you say, there's lots of areas of the economy.
Sectors,
where would you want to see that? Because there's no endless pit of money at the moment.
There's a whole series of sectors: aviation that you mentioned, automotive, aerospace, hospitality. These are all critical areas.
Where would you cut furlough from?
Well, it's not a question of cutting. What we've said to the government is that we understand the arguments that say, well, look, some of these companies are simply not going to survive, so we can't just pour money into them. That's why we've said that we need to be imaginative. We need to be looking at all kinds of different approaches.
What would you come up with?
Well, I mean, we've already raised with the government the idea of 50% work, so one job being done by two individuals, and then those individuals not being taxed. That effectively would give them 75%, 80% of their gross pay, which is what furlough does. And this is about, remember, getting us through this crisis. We will get through it, but we have to have an economy that's robust when we come through it. We have to have a thriving economy with skilled and experienced workers that is able to compete, because if we don't, we'll go into a downward spiral. And the Prime Minister is in danger of presiding over the highest record unemployment figures and highest record poverty ever. We've never seen anything like this since the 30s. It might even get worse than that if the government don't act.
Well, let's come on to questions about the government a bit later, because I want to talk about the Labour Party, given it is the start of Labour conference, although a slightly odd Labour conference given that it's going to be held virtually. How are things with Keir Starmer?
Fine. I was met up with Keir last week, and it was a good conversation.
You've had your fallings out, though. I remember when Rebecca Long-Bailey was sacked as Shadow Education Secretary, you said that was an unnecessary overreaction to a confected row.
I think that's right. So I think it was an unnecessary reaction, but it's gone.
You patched things up?
Yes, in terms of talking about... He's in a difficult position. Being leader of the Labour Party is the most difficult job in politics. He's taken over amid a pandemic crisis where it's extremely difficult. And I think what he's been doing to show up the incompetence in many ways of the Prime Minister, he's done very well.
Well, let's talk about the kinds of things that the Labour Party ought to be doing, not just as a party of opposition, but potentially as a party of government. You've talked about making sure that the Labour Party is speaking for working people, and Sir Keir Starmer has sort of branded the Labour Party as new leadership, that this is new leadership. What elements of Corbynism should Keir Starmer hold on to?
Well, he should hold on to the elements of Starmerism that he ran on. He ran on a...
But you didn't like those.
That's actually not true. The 10 pledges that he ran on, and he said in those pledges that he would make the moral case for socialism, are actually very ambitious and very progressive. And so that is where he should be following the idea of Corbynism. I mean, he's the one that mentioned the S word, socialism, the moral case for socialism. And Keir has to make a judgment call on when he can start putting some flesh on the bones of his vision. You just said, he's got to move on to tell us what it would be like in a general election. Well, the general election is 4 years away. I think he's quite clear that he will have to start to put together a vision that people understand. But really speaking, it's about him demonstrating that he's on the side of ordinary working people. He did a speech at the virtual TUC conference, where he demonstrated to me that he wants to be on the side of ordinary working people, and that's a good start. And so he needs to continue to do that, because that's the only way he'll win back the red wall seats.
Do you think he's got a difficulty, though, with being a knight of the realm, a very high-profile lawyer, a person that argued for a second referendum and to remain in the EU? Do you think that's a barrier for him?
I think the issue of Brexit and remain and leave, I'm pleased that he's come out and said, look, that's over. That argument is over. The people have very clearly said that they want to leave. In fact, the Tories got elected on that one issue. Get Brexit done. In terms of him being a knight and a barrister, he comes from a working class family. I don't think that'll impact.
And when we get to the point where a deal isn't on the table, there isn't a trade deal there, and we come out at the end of the year without one, what would you want to hear from Keir Starmer about a no trade deal Brexit?
Well, I'll certainly tell you what you'll hear from me. I'll be criticising the government for once again taking us into a perilous situation within our manufacturing base. I've said consistently that we should come out of Europe, but we should come out of Europe on the basis of protecting jobs and investment. And this government would be bordering on criminal if they actually take us, especially with this pandemic, if they take us deeper into what would be a very damaging recession, then frankly, all of us should be horrified by that.
Let me ask you this very finally before we finish. The 2019 manifesto didn't work out in that it wasn't the document that propelled Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. If you could keep one part of that election manifesto to pass on to Sir Keir Starmer to take forward, what would it be?
The reality is, and Keir has said this, that the basis of where he's coming from, it was embodied in the 2017 and the 2019 manifesto.
So that's all of it?
in this regard, they are all policies that are highly popular with the electorate.
You lost both.
No, we've seen it in 17 where we came within touching distance of power. In 2019, we lost for one reason only, and that was Brexit. Labour got it wrong on Brexit, and our supporters in our traditional areas felt that we'd let them down and betrayed them. I was telling the leadership that for over 12 months. Unfortunately, it wasn't listened to sufficiently, and we paid the price. But the policies that have been developed in the last 5 years by John McDonnell, who's done a brilliant job with the alternative economic strategy, and by Jeremy, are extremely popular. That's why Keir embraced them. That's why he ran on that platform. And I believe if he sticks on that route, he will be the next Prime Minister when the general election comes.
That is Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of Unite the Union, talking to me a little bit earlier today. I wonder what you make of that idea of hanging on to the 2017 and 2019 Labour manifestos as the path to power for Sir Keir. I want to continue to take your calls on that, by the way. 0345 6060 973. We'll talk too about the anger among Conservative MPs about what Joe Biden, the Democrat nominee to be president, has said in the last week, his comments on the UK-EU Brexit talks. Tom Swarbrick here, Swarbrick on Sunday, 12:47.
Coming up at 1 on LBC, Majid Nawaz.
The government is set to introduce fines of up to £10,000 for people who breach self-isolation rules. But will this work, or will it just act as a disincentive for people to go and test?
Majid Nawaz on LBC. Information. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster on LBC.
Here's James on 84850. Tom, you always beat me to it. Thank you, James. Was just about to text, Sunak versus Starmer at the next election is the political equivalent of Joshua versus Fury. A total barnstormer, says James. Here's Mike in Portsmouth on the subject of the Labour leader. Hi there, Mike.
Hi, Tom.
Hello.
Tom, I don't think Labour's changed at all. The first test this week, when Boris introduced the UK internal market bill, and that was the first day Keir was isolating. So who do they put up? Instead of putting Angela Rayner, who's like the deputy leader, they put Ed Miliband. Failed Ed Miliband, frothing at the mouth as usual, and that means, well, she's a woman. You've got to, represent the women. You've got to represent.
Yeah, but Angela, to be fair, Angela Rayner did then appear at PMQs in place of Keir Starmer, and the general reception to Ed Miliband's performance was that he was very good.
He was very good, but the thing is, it's still London-centric. There's the elite again, where the people, if they want to get the red wall, knock the red bricks out, and make them red again.
Yeah,
they're gonna, and those people want to hear the northern accent.
But so Angela Rayner, people would have loved Angela Rayner. The only thing that I think might counter some of that, Mike, is the fact that those people who voted Labour all their lives, who voted Conservative at the last election, voted for a Prime Minister who is the epitome of the metropolitan elite, isn't he? I mean, he's an Eton-educated Oxbridge graduate who who lives in London.
Yeah, but I think it went beyond that a little bit. Everyone's saying that the Red Wall people voted just for Brexit. Everyone's forgetting that it was also about the leader. No one wanted Jeremy Corbyn.
No, I agree. Mike, I totally agree with you. I think that was one of the things that put Labour in the position that they find themselves in, was because ultimately Jeremy Corbyn turned out was unelectable. Mike, thank you. Here's Martin in Barnsley. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Tom. I spoke to you many times about this.
Sir.
The Red Wall, that battle needs to wait until the Labour Party can beat Nicola Sturgeon. It's over, because people in England are terrified of Nicola Sturgeon. So therefore, they'll carry on voting Conservative. So I wrote,
do you know, the maths, you're absolutely spot on, Martin, and not enough is spoken about this particular point. The maths are not good for Labour if they don't pick up seats in Scotland. I mean, it's really, really tough.
It's not just that, is it? They've got to beat Nicola Sturgeon at all costs. If that means bringing Alistair Darling out of retirement, do it. Same with Gordon Brown, do it. And beat Nicola Sturgeon at that election, Martin, at all costs.
It is. These are the local elections that are taking place in May. Many people worried that, of course, if the SNP get a majority, then that is a mandate for another referendum. And what would Keir Starmer do were he to be Prime Minister in that position? Martin, it's a great point. Thank you for it. Come to more of your calls in just a moment. 12:53. Let's talk about the Conservative MP anger at what Joe Biden has said this week regarding the UK-EU Brexit talks. Sir Christopher Mayer is the former British ambassador to the United States under both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Good to see you again, Sir Christopher. Thank you for coming on the programme this afternoon.
Tom, how are you?
I'm very well, sir. I'm glad you're up and running again. Let me ask you about what Joe Biden said, first of all. Do you think it was necessary for him to tweet what he tweeted, saying that that any trade deal between the US and UK must be contingent upon respect for the Good Friday Agreement?
Yeah, I think it's entirely to be expected in a US presidential election campaign, which is going to be pretty damn close. Biden is not a shoo-in to win. He doesn't want to offend one of the most important political groupings in the United States, namely Irish Republican Americans. That was a way of making sure that particular part of his base was consolidated. So I don't think we should get too uptight about this, too excited. It was largely to be expected.
The timing of it is interesting, not only insofar as it came after the internal market bill, but also, we understand, after Dominic Raab met the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Washington as part of his trip. I wonder if you see the timing of the tweet, given the meeting that he'd had with Nancy Pelosi, as a bit of a kicking or a snub or anything of that nature.
Well, the thing, Tom, you have to understand is that Washington, D.C., like the United States of America, is an Irish Republican territory. You're not going to get impartial view of anything that might suggest a threat to the Good Friday Agreement. Now, most unfortunately, the way in which Brandon Lewis's statement in the House of Commons was interpreted in the United States was through the filter of the Irish Republic, the Irish Embassy, and even possibly Sinn Féin. That was what it was like when I was in the United States, and I don't think much has changed. So the arrival of Dominic Raab in the United States, an attempt to explain the British government's point of view, was seen as a perfect moment, to use your phrase, to administer a kicking.
Let me ask you about relations between this current government and the Biden team or potential administration. Both Theresa May and Boris Johnson have been very quick to try and bring Donald Trump in, to try and fate him and try and get into his head to affect his decision-making. Do you think they've done that at the expense of getting closer to the Democrats and potentially Biden's team too?
Well, they should do, because when you have a presidential election, the most important thing for a British government to do is not to interfere in any way, shape or form in the outcome of the election by expressing a preference for a winner. So it is very, very important for the Boris Johnson administration to stay neutral and out of sight while this campaign goes on, because there have been instances in the past where a British government or a British Prime Minister has shown a preference for one side over the other, and this sticks, this stays, and it's very hard to get it off. So already
keep the nose clean.
Yeah, I mean, Biden people will assume that Boris has a natural affinity with Donald Trump, because that is what almost the entire liberal establishment in the United States believes. If you only have to read the New York Times to see this. So tread carefully is my warning to this government.
So Christopher Mayer, thank you very much indeed for your time, former British ambassador to the US under both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, I should say. Don't go back that far. Christopher, thank you. I'm ageing you unnecessarily. Let's finish with some calls. Here's Roy in St Albans on the new-ish Labour leader. Hi there, Roy.
Yes, good morning. I was born in the early 30s into a family of party activists, and it just makes me smile listening to your programme this morning. The Labour Party still haven't learned. They're on about a new referendum, another Don't they understand that that's one of the reasons they lost? And it seems they just will never learn. And as a Conservative, albeit a reluctant one, they're just handing it to the Conservative Party. And the trouble is, we need a credible, opposition, don't we?
Yes, but what referendum is it that you're worried about the Labour Party banging on about again?
No, I'm not worried about it. Is they want another referendum? You listen to the other. This is
well, they don't want another. They don't want another Brexit referendum now. Well, hang on a sec, Roy. The Keir Starmer has said Brexit's done. It's over. The argument's finished. We're leaving. We're out. That's all behind him. My point is more about whether people who voted for it and feel it is part of their identity, and that having democracy being able to have an effect, i.e. whether you voted for it or not, the decision to leave was taken and a majority voted for it, therefore it ought to really happen. That is bigger than just Brexit. And the fact that Keir Starmer went against that initially, I wonder if you think that will come back to haunt him nearer the next election.
I think it will. I honestly think it will. But taking the whole programme, listening to your programme, it seems the Labour Party can never seem to learn. They've won, 3 elections since the 50s, and they still don't learn. And I don't mind, because although I'm not happy with this Conservative government, it's much better than the alternative, isn't it? Well, in my opinion.
Well, I think there are certainly millions of people that agreed with you that it was better than Jeremy Corbyn, but we're past that now, aren't we, Roy? Thank you. Listen, thank you so much for your call. Thank you for all your calls over the course of the programme this morning and this afternoon. I'm with you on Monday night at 10 p.m. I'd be very grateful if you could join us there, Monday night to Thursday night, 10 p.m, and of course back for Swarbrick on Sunday, 10 a.m. next weekend. Thank you for your time. If you missed any of it, the Global Player is there. You can watch it all back if you should wish as well. YouTube, Twitter, we're everywhere. I'm back with you Monday night at 10, 4 o'clock, it's Ian Payne. Next on LBC, Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Coming up, members of the Honours Committee are proposing an overhaul of the system that could eliminate the word empire from the awards OBE and MBE. What could the name of our honours be replaced with? Before that, Waltham Forest, the suburb that pioneered the 20-minute neighbourhood, is being hailed as a successful experiment. Are we as a nation in dire need of rediscovering the beauty of being rooted in a local community? I think so. But first, the government is set to introduce fines of up to £10,000 for people who breach self-isolation rules as Britain steps up preparations for a potential second wave of COVID-19. But will this work, or is it all an overreaction?
on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 1 o'clock, the Health Secretary has warned the UK faces